See, again, every time, I'm like, oh yeah, I totally got everything ready. Totally time to go. We're totally good. We can start now. Every time, I'm like, oh wait, there's 5 more things. You know what? I just realized none of my lights are on. You know, 5 more things. Okay. Just up. So you can see. Oh my god, look at this shit. The boxes are piled to the ceiling. I just need 1 more box. I can't get rid of those though because I'm gonna tear them up and use them for projects. So those boxes, unfortunately, have to stick around for a while. Why isn't that working? You know why it's not working? Because I didn't turn it on. That's why. There we go. Look at that. You can't really see. There, it's working. Okay. So, howdy. I'm Proletariat Prince. Welcome to the stream. We're gonna have a good day today. We're doing Reading Rainbow, the Gayer, aka the Synthesis Project. It kind of has a name. It's kind of developing a name now. And this is episode 2. So first episode, we played Viscera Cleanup Detail, and we read 3 articles. This time, we're reading 2, 3, 4, and 5, so 4 chapters. And we're playing Don't Starve. So cancel. Play. New game. Character. World. See, the world is important. What is this? I think this is storms, right? Less storms. World size. I feel like a large world. Can we do huge world? Try a huge world. Default. Well, less. Land loop. No. Seasons. Only winter, only summer. Long summer. Let's do a long summer. Seasons start in summer. Day. Long day. Regular rain. More. Lots. Actually, we can put all of these on lots. Lots. I don't know what this one is really. No caves. I always die. Ah, shit. Yeah, we could try the caves. Lots. You know, it's good to have lots. I like, I want to play, it's easy mode. We're playing easy mode. None. Less. More. Lots. Default. Actually, we need more of these guys. We need lots of them. None. Less. None. Less. Look, okay, it's the game. None. Absolutely none. The point of this is not to, you know, have fun and play the game. The point of this is to have fun and play the game. Wow, I'm, you know, absorbing the words, okay? It's kind of hard to absorb the words when you're getting killed by everything. So, you know, we just go nice and easy. I'm gonna turn down music. Could have done that a while ago, but I didn't. I don't know why. What happened? Did it break? Oh no, it's good. We're good. Go. Yeah, okay, that's cool. Let's read aloud.
2. Global and local. Communicative networks. And implications for literacy. Charles Bazerman. So there is this story going around that the world is flat, Friedman, 2005, such that all knowledge, all finances, all communication can flow everywhere to result in a thin shallow sheet of water, maybe just thick enough to drown us all. If all were flat, our educational mission would be a lot simpler. Somebody needs to give these people 3D glasses. For millennia, humans have been developing structures of communication, knowledge, and institutions that provide the spaces within which we play our lives. Knowledge, in particular, is created, inscribed and stored, calculated upon, accessed and applied from particular kinds of documents, or genres, which then circulate in specific activity systems within particular languages. Bazerman and Rogers, 2008a, 2008b. As literacy becomes the knowledge and calculative infrastructure of social institutions, relationships, and actions, we come to live our lives in a built symbolic environment. Bazerman, 2011. The activity systems within which knowledge flows are complexly organized, finely structured, and deeply varied. Bazerman, 1994, Russell, 1997. The meaning and functions of knowledge even within a single system vary depending on participant interests, roles, and positions. Movement of knowledge across systems, such as from science to law, is far from automatic, requiring translation and repurposing. Language, social, and national differences increase variety and add barriers to common knowledge. The broad spread of knowledge and common orientations to that knowledge are a result of active communicative work by groups and individuals with interests in extended activity systems and shared knowledge. These range from scientists with a variety of first languages seeking to engage in common inquiries to entertainment and tourist industries wanting to extend markets, from governmental agencies and NGOs attempting to solve regional and global problems, to...
Okay, so what was going on here? The world's flat. Literacy becomes the knowledge and calculative infrastructure of social institutions, relationships, and actions. We come to live our lives in a built symbolic environment. Ooh, that's fun. Knowledge in particular is created, inscribed, and stored, calculated upon, accessed, and applied from particular kinds of documents or genres, which then circulate in specific activity systems within particular languages. So, you think about knowledge as the Twitch stream. It's created, it's streamed, it's inscribed and stored, calculated upon, analytics, I guess, accessed and applied from particular kinds of documents or genres. You watch a bunch of different streamers, and you know... Can we not? Oh, I have to, I have to select it. Yeah, so, yeah. Specific activity systems within particular languages. So, I have no idea where I'm going with this, but yeah, it's, we're going to do interesting things today.
Literacy as translingual practice, between Copyright 2014 Charles Bazerman.
There we go.
Investment bankers wanting to coordinate and profit from increasingly integrated economies. These networks continue to grow denser, larger, more complex, with higher entry barriers, even though the balance and relationship of some of the more obvious components are shifting. A short history of literacy and society. Literacy and communication at a distance have at each juncture in their history been associated with changing social arrangements, sometimes reinforcing existing relations and institutions, but more often putting power in new hands and building new forms of organization that are larger, deeper, and more complex. Let me cite some episodes. In the ancient Fertile Crescent, the introduction of literacy helped farmers to keep track of produce, amass larger holdings than they could directly keep watch over, and transmit property without immediate physical transfer. It allowed traders to make deals over wider areas, make contracts, and amass great wealth. It facilitated governments spreading and coordinating power over larger domains, subordinating other kingdoms and tribes, gathering taxes, establishing uniform laws, and organizing and controlling large military forces and bureaucracies. Belief, as well, could become organized and disseminated through scriptures, CRE. Aiding modern religions, with literate clerical bureaucracies that could interpret and apply divine writ, administer, collect gifts, gather holdings, and regulate followers. Goody, 1986. The Chinese Empire showed the power of the unification of all these leader-aid systems: government, law, finances, belief, and knowledge across a wide domain. The invention of the printing press served to reinforce the organizational structures already in place, as it quickly came under imperial control to produce documents for government use or to reproduce the classical canon, which reinforced the centralized culture and provided texts for students taking the imperial exams. Baudet, 1991, Carter, 1955, Lee, 2000, Luo, 1998. This containment by the central authority and used to intensify central control was facilitated by a common literate language, purchased at great cost in blood and book burning. As a result, for 2,000 years there was a highly developed literacy in Mandarin among the elites, but they were largely isolated from L2 books. Further, few speakers of other languages could effectively read Chinese texts, let alone participate in the Chinese literate world. Needham, 1970. About a century ago, a series of changes in China began transforming these literate communicative dynamics, with the process still ongoing. Chen, 2010. In Europe, the printing press arrived about 5 centuries after it did so in China, at a time of religious and political fracturing, and served to further that fracturing along with establishing institutions and communities that escaped national, religious, and cultural borders. Literacy, printing, and participation in transnational networks of commerce, science, technology, belief, and philosophic. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirokayast.com. Copyright 2013. Taylor, Global and Local Communicative Networks and Implications for Literacy 15. Inquiry became assets to many of the emerging nations in their struggles. Thus some states sponsored more open inquiries and communications, Eisenstein, 1979. One final example in the United States, the coordinated introduction of telegraphy and railroads facilitated the transformation from local agrarian economies with limited small-scale manufactures to a national corporate economy and a national market, Yates, 1989. The nation-state and the organization of literate activity systems. By the 19th century, such dynamics had left the nation-state as a central organizing principle in much of the developed world. Laws, economies, corporations, governance mechanisms, transportation systems, education, languages, politics, and even newspapers were organized and regulated largely within national boundaries and carried out within national languages. Anderson, 1983. Less developed countries that wanted to enter as players into the global system needed to develop those nationally bounded systems of internal governance, economy, and culture in order to take their place among nations, as occurred in Mexico in the 1920s and thereafter. De Los Santos, 2007. Prior to the 20th century there was, of course, trans-regional communication. Trade routes and interregional dissemination of texts go back to antiquity, but they were limited arrangements. Example Frank, 1998. Also, the fluid history of European royal families and borders had created a transnational European commerce and culture, though the effect was mostly limited to the elites. Imperialism was the primary mechanism by which the scope of nationally organized systems spread beyond primary borders. Imperialism also led to the development of communicative systems, whether the large correspondence and archive networks centered in Seville and London or technological advances such as foreign postal systems and telegraphy. Imperialism also led to global distribution of selected European languages and a limited and asymmetric intermingling of cultures. In the post-World War II period, European-wide institutions of security, governance, and economics have also emerged and gained strength, overlaying national bureaucracies and institutions, resulting in a flourishing translation industry. Recently, movement of students and employees has increased multilingual competence. Yet, de facto, this may mean that the working language of most institutions winds up being English, as it is the language that Finns, Romanians, Spaniards, and Czechs have in common with some degree of fluency. Globally, international cooperation after World War II seeking peace and security have resulted in such institutions as the United Nations, but also realized through many NGOs and regional organizations. The great divisions of the Cold War, and now the turmoil in the Islamic world, have also fostered a global orientation. These, in turn, foster an ideology of international curiosity, influencing literacy as translingual practice, between communities and classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirokayast.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?mark.id=sign 1143714. Created from Humboldt on September 7, 2022, 22:31 and 58 seconds. Copyright 2013. Taylor and Francis Group. All rights reserved. 16 Charles Bazerman. The education and entertainment industries. International tourism, including its ideological themes of culture, environmentalism, and service, has coordinately increased as transportation has become easier and affluence has grown in some parts. Science, from its early years, had been an international endeavor, relying on the printing press for its global reach. Eisenstein, 1979, but in the 20th century it grew rapidly, transforming higher education. All these domains, however, have become pervaded by economic development and the growth of corporations that became large powers within states and the vehicles for cooperation, until the corporations themselves escaped the bounds of the nations. I can hardly begin to unpack this complex story of economic growth, corporatism, and capitalism, and the formation of entities of sufficient power and wealth to dominate nations. Nor can I unpack the intertwining of economic interests, scientific growth, rise of global entertainment industries, the formation of global news, and new cooperations among nations. Immigration also has changed.
Hardly begin to unpack this complex story of economic growth, corporatism, and capitalism, and the formation of entities of sufficient power and wealth to dominate nations. We're going to unpack the intertwining of economic interest, scientific growth, rise of global entertainment industries, formation of global news, and the new cooperations among nations. Okay.
Changed. It was initially fostered by imperialism, which brought imperial nationals to rule over foreign lands. As land and property was taken from indigenous peoples, many of whom perished, immigrants from other regions were also encouraged or forced by slavery to come to the newly opened lands, bringing their heritage languages within them, particularly in the Americas after independence. Up to World War I in the United States, Scandinavian and German immigrant communities continued to use and school in their heritage languages, and New York City maintained multiple linguistically insulated communities. Brazil, Chile, and Argentina have many European-speaking enclaves, and some even had monolingual heritage language schools until recently. But throughout the 20th century, the pressures for national loyalty, identity, and economic integration have demoted heritage languages to a marginal cultural practice. L1 public education grew in the USA and elsewhere. However, in recent decades, indigenous communities have been gaining rights. More immigrants are arriving as fully educated, and the rise of multinational companies has created an international group of managers, diverse within their corporations and moving about the world. Immigrants are likely to visit homelands and maintain business relations, supporting multiple identities and languages. All these changes have gone hand in hand with changing ideologies of diversity and complex identities within immigrant countries. Many countries, nonetheless, still resist immigration or impose large nationalizing pressures on immigrants. Whatever these observations add up to, this is now the world we must help our students thrive in. This does not mean we have to approve of all the elements of it. The fact that the strongest institutions globally are now becoming financial and corporate, able to trump the interests and needs of nation-states and other institutions, I find deeply troubling. But if there are strong networks to counterbalance them, it may not be the older institutions of the nation-state that can do it, and we need to facilitate our students to contribute to building other literacy as translingual practice, between communities and classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. Copyright Global and Local Communicative Networks and Implications for Literacy 17. Communicative social systems with global force to assert other interests on the transnational level. In particular, I want to follow through on several implications. Changing immigration and changing students. Among our students we may find students whose heritage language has more vitality and a greater role in their lives than previously, who have strong connections with relatives in other regions, supported by communicative technologies, and who have substantial international experience. This will impact the ideas, goals, and knowledge they bring to their writing tasks, as well as their knowledge of and attitude toward language. Changing career paths of students. Students' careers are likely to involve large institutions with complex communicative environments which they will need to understand in order to participate effectively. They will need to understand the complex, multiple, and segmented audiences of their writing, particularly as framed by organizational roles. They will need to understand the distributed and collaborative processes and how to contribute effectively within them. They will need to understand the genres, their purposes, their circulation paths, and the actions they need to accomplish within the complex activity system of the organization. If students enter the riskier world of the professions, emergent organizations, journalism, or public sphere activity, they will need even more subtle knowledge of the communicative systems they are going up against and how they can create counter-discourses and communicative institutions that will project other interests forcefully and that will create thoughtful judgments. Further, in all careers, to communicate effectively people will need to be able to consider the role of data and knowledge appropriate to each domain, and wield that knowledge intelligently and analytically, relying on theoretical orientations. In many academic, industrial, governance, and activist roles, they will need to be able to collect data, find new knowledge, and develop powerful theory and ideas as the basis for action. This brings us to universities. How universities stand with respect to other institutions. Universities first developed in Europe as a response to the influx of manuscripts into Europe through Muslim Spain during the Wars of Re-Christianization in Constantinople, Makdisi, 1981, Ritter Simoens, 1991. The guilds of students and scholars that formed came under the control of the Church, and the teachings were limited to a limited canon that remained largely fixed even after the religious proliferation of the Reformation. Rote learning of texts with authoritative literacy as translingual practice, between communities and classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirocast.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?doc ID =11437114. Created from Humboldt on September 7, 2022, 22:31 and 58. Copyright 2018 Charles Bazerman. Interpretation from the professor became entrenched as the educational model. The sciences only gained a substantial place in the 19th century after the French and German reforms of the university, Rueg, 2004, with engineering, social sciences, and business only gaining major university place in the 20th century, Porter and Ross, 2003. With the reforms and changing knowledges within the university, national differences proliferated, but rote learning of authoritatively presented canonical texts remained the dominant educational mode in much of the world. Examination often remained oral but, even when written, writing skills needed to reproduce pre-formulated knowledge were limited. Major exceptions were the German seminar model and the Oxbridge tutorial model. The United States was the other major exception, because of the need from the beginning to create social elites in a land without a long-standing elite class. And after the revolution to create citizen leaders for democracy. Rhetorical training was at first central to the curriculum, and then the USA modified the GER man disciplinary specialization model by keeping 2 years of general education.
Hold on. Rhetorical training. United States, the major exception of risk. From the beginning to create social elites in the land, the long-standing elite class, so that would be, kings, queens, nobility, that kind of shit. After the revolution, to create citizen leaders for democracy. Rhetorical training was at first central to the curriculum, and then the USA modified German. Okay, can you chill the fuck out? I'm reading here. Stand next to the within which the writing requirement emerged under the auspices of literature departments. Okay, so like we are talking about like teaching English, kind of like this is the background for this text. So this unique history has meant that there's been a much stronger emphasis on meaning, expression, idea development, analysis, agency. Fuck you. And identity. Oh my god, I can't even. And identity than elsewhere, as other nations are now are finding need to provide more support for advanced academic writing. They're needing to find institutional space for it to happen, but there's typically no department that has it in their economic interest to mount courses. And intellectual leadership tends to come either from within the disciplines or more often from applied linguistics or educational colleges. Ooh, each of these sponsoring locations has its own perception and priorities. Oh. I don't have any thoughts yet, but it's interesting. I don't know.
Part I. Premises. Literacy as translingual
Why
practice.
did that sentence all the way back? What the fuck? Oh my god. There you go. Immigration has also changed. Career paths, how universities. Okay, I think it's this one. There we go. Continue.
Part I.
Aloud.
Premises.
Why? You know what? Fuck you. That's so annoying. Okay, you're gonna read.
Part I.
Literacy, oh my God.
Copyright literacy group created from copyright 2. Global and local communicative and global and local communicative networks and communicative changing career paths. Students how universities stand with universities first developed literacy as translingual practice. Copyright 18 Charles Bazerman. Interpretation from the professor became.
Oh, here we go. Okay, so then
how universities stand with respect. Skills needed to reproduce pre-formulated knowledge were limited. Major exceptions were the German seminar model and the Oxbridge tutorial model. Literacy as copyright 2013. Each of these sponsoring locations has its own perception and priorities.
We got it.
Another key issue for universities is who pays the bills and who calls the shots. For centuries, the universities were church institutions, fostering elites for church-dominated societies. In the United States, beginning with Jefferson's plan for the University of Virginia, and the later the Morrill Act, the state asserted for public universities an interest in creating an educated citizenry, developing regional economies, and advancing knowledge, fostered by free inquiry and broad freedom of expression, within American rights ideology and within the separation of church and state, with little specific immediate accountability. Vasey, 1965. Through the middle of the 20th century, however, even as public support for higher education expanded, government saw more direct interest in academic knowledge, beginning with the Manhattan Project and reflected in current high levels of Department of Defense research funding. Van Nostrand, 1997. In addition, in recent decades industry has begun to assert its authority over university priorities. Further, as the power of academic inquiry to influence an educated citizenry and foster social change began to be realized, some political forces became suspicious of and attempted to limit university autonomy. Particularly relevant to writing is the increasing research orientation of universities that has heightened the focus both on graduate education and on the undergraduate major as a preparation for graduate education and research careers. Literacy as translingual practice, between communities and Classrooms.
Yeah, just shut up for a minute. Power of academic inquiry to influence an educated citizenry and foster such change began to be realized. Some political forces became suspicious of and attempted to limit university autonomy. Oh my God. Incredibly relevant to what is happening today. Not today. Like, the past couple weeks in the news. I actually brought this up in class a few days ago. But, student loans. Why do we have such huge student loans compared to our grandparents? Because of the political forces that are suspicious of and attempting to limit university autonomy. How do we do this? By limiting who has access to education. First of all, when you take a system that allows people to get education for low cost or free, then you make it accessible to the vast majority of people. That means the vast majority of people are becoming more educated. They're using their power of academic inquiry to influence educated citizenry and foster social change, which means that you limit the university capacity for spreading knowledge that wide. That means that you take the education away from people and you make it a thing of the elite. I don't know. I'm losing. The point is that you have massive student loans. If you're a student, you have massive student loans because of this. And yeah. Where was I going? Particularly relevant to writing is I'm not sure about this next line. But particularly relevant to writing is the increasing research orientation of universities that has heightened focus both on graduate education and undergraduate major as preparation for graduate education and research careers. I don't know.
Levels
about
of Department
this.
of Defense research funding. Van Nostrand. Nostrand, 19.
Department of Defense research funding. So Department of Defense research funding, that would be like drones and shit, wouldn't it?
1997. In addition, in recent decades industry has begun to assert its authority over university priorities.
Okay, yeah, that's cool.
Zenry and foster social change began to be realized. Some political forces became suspicious of and attempted to limit university autonomy. Particularly relevant to writing is the increasing literacy as translingual practice between communities and classrooms. Copyright 2013. Global and local communicative networks and implications for literacy 19. The increasing role for writing education in the USA and globally. In both the developed and developing world, expectations of participation of faculty in international research and scholarship and the growth of advanced degree programs are increasing, often tied to governmental funding models, as in England.
Oh. Okay, so this is more, we are focusing on results rather than just the value of education itself. So if we take this to, children's education, this is, again, the standardized testing. We are standardized testifying adult education. So instead of, you learn things because it's good to have an educated populace, you're learning things because you're going to do something with what you've learned. That's why people get mad about the idea of like gender studies and underwater basket weaving degrees, because like, what are you actually producing with those things? There's no jobs. But if you have a job that means that where you, or if you have a degree where you're researching things and you're producing results from your research, then that means that your major is valuable. And so it's this, as education becomes increasingly, as the people who receive education shrink, as it becomes available to fewer and fewer people, like available, accessible, whatever you want to call it, it becomes even more highly specialized. So instead of learning, the basic knowledge, you're learning, extremely specialized knowledge that isn't really practical, almost. And I'm coming here from the perspective that the things that I have to teach you should be practical. The theory that I have to teach you should be practical. The theory that people should be writing should be practical. It should not be impractical. Theory is how we understand the way the world works. Theory should be practical, theory should be accessible, and theory should be something that you are able to see in your day-to-day life. So like, if the focus is on results, creating results for the sake of results, then we lose that aspect of practicality. And then, we have the conflicting social mores of, the anti-intellectualism that is in America. So, of course, as education becomes more specialized, more distanced from, the average person working at Walmart who used to be able to get a degree at a state university, it becomes more associated with like the elite. And that's why you have, podcasters and people out there who are like, oh, you have a college education, you're the middle class, the upper class now. And it's like, no, that class is it's do you work at a job or not? Do you work at a job? You're working class. I don't care how much money you make. Do you work at a job? Do you own the workplace? You're the middle class. You're not the working class. But there's a lot of people out there like the billionaires who say, I work at the company too. I work just as hard. And they're trying to like pretend that they're working class billionaires. And it's like, no, you're the owning class. There's the working class. There's the owning class. Sometimes called the middle class. Do you work or do you own? I don't mean like, do you own a nice car? I mean, do you own the business? Do you own the means of production? Who owns the means of production? Let's do the clapping. Who owns the means of production in this equation? If you don't own the means of production, you're the working class. Everybody else, shut up. I will literally, like, I'm willing to fight people about that because there's so much misinformation and so much, like, silliness. Like, I have a nice car, so I'm the middle class. Like, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, you can't afford to know what you're talking about, I guess, because the cost of university is so ridiculously high. But whatever. I don't care. I can't afford it either. That's why I have a shit ton of student loans. Anyway, where were we? I went off on a tangent there because, I mean, this topic makes me, like, so fucking angry. It does. It makes me angry. It makes me feel rage. I feel the burning rage inside my soul. Can we actually, like, zoom in on this some more? Oh, we can. Yeah. There we go.
Zenry and foster social change.
Okay.
Literacy as translingual practice. Copyright.
You know that's not what
Economies.
I'm doing.
Literacy as translingual practice. Anyway. Copyright. Tooth. Global and local communicative net.
There we go. Okay. We're back where we were. So yeah, the expectation that education should produce results is neoliberal bullshit, and in this essay I will...
The increasing role for writing education in the USA and globally.
I don't know.
In both the developed and developing world, expectations of participation of faculty in international research and scholarship and the growth of advanced degree programs are increasing, often tied to governmental funding models, as in England, Spain, Hong Kong, Mexico, Brazil, and Chile. This pressure on graduate students and faculty has required higher degrees of more tightly focused and evidenced original arguments tied to disciplinary contributions. In addition, needs to have professionals at the highest international level to address pressing problems in health.
I have to. And evidenced original arguments tied to disciplinary contributions. Okay, so this is the shit I'm talking about. Evidence more tightly focused and evidence original arguments tied to disciplinary contributions. So instead of tying things to your real life, like what your real experiences are, your lived experience, we're tying things to the discipline itself. We are theorizing the discipline itself rather than how the discipline relates to life. That's not useful to anybody except people within the discipline. Okay, that's not... I mean, sure, it may sound good, it may look good, but it's not actually good.
Health, environment, and other issues requiring scientific knowledge have required full participation in global academic and governance communications. Local economic interests are, as well, being tied into global financial and corporate organizations. The problem is often first recognized at the end of the educational process, when graduate students need to write theses and dissertations, or researchers need to publish. Often the first writing support offered is at the master's and doctoral level, but in some cases this is starting to wash back to the undergraduate and secondary level. Of course, having highly skilled academic writers at the graduate level requires continuous attention and support from the earliest years of schooling onward. As writing support seeps downward, it raises tensions with whatever local traditions and beliefs about literacy and writing have been forming the curricula at lower levels, because the higher end needs for professionals, business, and researchers are shaped by contemporary international standards. The issue of English and multilingualism. Writing at the higher end of professionalism, scientific and medical research, multinational corporate and financial organizations, international activism, government cooperation, and so on, means that writing is directed towards the international languages of cooperation, which currently is predominantly English, although in evolving forms to reflect its new global status. Crystal, 2003. Earlier colonialism, recent corporate neocolonialism, the Cold War, and U.S. military dominance are no doubt important forces in this linguistic spread, along with media and popular culture from films to the internet. But also are the dominance of U.S. and British science and academic research in the latter half of the 20th century. The expansion and reputation of U.S. universities and the attractiveness of the elite British universities has meant that many leading scholars, professionals, and government and corporate leaders received undergraduate or graduate educations in the United States. Because of this academic dominance, in a number of countries the medium of instruction shifts from local languages to English as students move from secondary to higher education and postgraduate education, particularly in scientific disciplines. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013.
No, you
Copyright 2020 Charles Bazerman. Whatever the forces that have led to the situation, there is no doubt English is the dominant global language and becomes more important as one moves into elite or leadership professions, though elite British and US dialects no longer set absolute standards. English has escaped the English-speaking nations so that now there are about twice as many people who speak English as an additional language than do so as a first language. Of the estimated 1.5 billion English speakers in the world, half are from not from English-speaking countries or the former colonial empires of the USA and Britain. Crystal, 2003, pages 68 to 69. If we stratified English speaking in those countries by education, wealth, or position, we might have even more striking results. Further, English as a language has escaped the control of dominant dialects from England and the USA, as new dialects have developed and are gaining recognition in different regions, though the weight of propriety and education still tilts towards Anglo-American.
We're doing something new today. Well, it's not new. I did it last week. I don't know if you're still here. But anyway, if you are still here, yeah, I'm responding. I'm not really responding. I'm reading this, I guess you could say, and I'm synthesizing. We're doing a synthesize. It's for my, it's for my Literacies and Epistemologies class. Anyway, let's, motherfucker. Oh, fuck you. Everything wants to kill me.
Anglo-American Prestige Dialects, Cottrell, 1990. The international role of English carries the ideological baggage of the events that fostered its growth. Equally, the growing dominance of English exerts unfortunate pressures on local languages, as many of the more sophisticated and/or power-related functions migrate to the international language. Yet global cooperation requires some ability to communicate with each other in a common language. In the past, the emergence of international languages of cooperation was accompanied and maintained by the governmental and religious institutions, often at the cost of violence. The rise of English certainly followed this pattern, but it is not clear that this will be the case in the future, as many of the interests and activities supporting global English are no longer tied so directly and exclusively in the interests of the English-speaking nations. For example, the default language on the websites of both Unilever and Philips is English, not Dutch. As are all the major company documents available there, despite the history and corporate homes of each being in the Netherlands. We will see what the future holds, and also whether communication technology cements this global presence of English, or whether improvement of translation technologies will allow more symmetricality among languages. Nonetheless, in the interim, there seems a real global need for English, and knowledge of English creates inequities not just between nations but within non-English speaking nations, between those who can write fluently and precisely participate in international activities and those who cannot. As language and literacy educators, this is an issue of vital concern, defining our role. The increase in diverse forms of writing research. All the concerns I have spoken about to this point have eventuated in an increase internationally in research on writing processes, how people develop as writers, how education can support writing development, and other related issues. This has happened in each region, but has also led to international communication and support. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2000 and copyright 2013. Taylor and Francis Group, Global and Local Communicative Networks and Implications for Literacy 21. In the United States.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna zoom out on this one because
the increasing role for writing education in the USA and globally. In both the issue of English and multilingualism. Writing at the higher end of journalism, scientific and research, multinational corp.
Oh my god. What just happened?
Military dominance, literacy as translingual, copyright 20 Charles Bazerman. Whatever the forces that have led to the situation, there is no are gaining recognition in different regions, though the weight of propriety and education still tilts towards Anglo-American prestige dialects. Cottrell, 1990. The international role of English carries the ideological baggage of the events that fostered its growth.
Straight up,
equally, the growing dominance of English exerts unfortunate pressures on local languages, as many of the more sophisticated and / or power-related functions migrate to the international language. Yet global cooperation requires some ability to communicate with each other in a common language. In the past, the emergence of international languages of cooperation was accompanied and maintained by the governmental and religious institutions, often at the cost of violence.
Can you all
the rise
move?
of English certainly followed this pattern, but it is not clear that this will be the case in the future, as many of the interests and activities supporting global English are no longer tied so directly and exclusively in the interests of the English-speaking nations. For example, the default language on the websites of both Unilever and Philips is English, not Dutch, as are all the major company documents available there, despite the history and corporate homes of each being in the...
If she's talking too fast, if she's too quiet, if you have any questions, any comments, feel free to, contribute, feel free to ask. There are no bad questions. Just bad answers sometimes, maybe? I don't know. Point is, feel free to interact in any way that works for you. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay. I'm just gonna put this right here. All these frogs keep coming after me. Anyway.
Being in the Netherlands, we will see what the future holds, and also whether communication technology cements this global presence of English, or whether improvement of translation technologies will allow more symmetricality among languages. Nonetheless, in the interim, there seems a real global need for English, and knowledge of English creates inequities not just between nations but within non-English speaking nations, between those who can write fluently and precisely participate in international activities and those who cannot. As language and literacy educators, this is an issue of vital concern, defining our role. The increase in diverse forms of writing research. All the concerns I have spoken about to this point have eventuated in an increase internationally in research on writing processes, how people develop as writers, how education can support writing development, and other related issues. This has happened in each region, but has also led to international communication and support. Literacy Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral. Copyright 2 Global and Local Communicative Networks and Implications for Literacy 21. In the United States, while there was some movement to advance research on the teaching of writing since the 1960s with linguistically based work, and peaking in the mid-1980s with cognitive psychological research, this effort remained small compared to the large endeavor of the teaching of writing and the growth of practice-based institutions like the National Writing Project, the Conference on College Composition and Communication, and the Council of Writing Program Administrators. In the 1990s this psychological work diminished, but work on rhetorical history and the history of the profession continued, and there were regular conferences. Student and community-based ethnography grew, as did studies of specialized forms of writing in science, technology, and industry, but largely meeting at the periphery of practice-based meetings. As Haswell, 2005, document, National Council of Teachers of English-based institutions were not centrally focused on research, though a few independent research journals thrived. I must qualify this characterization in one way. The opportunities of the new communicative technologies, changing the economies and dynamics of publishing and expanding the possibilities of student expression, were rapidly taken up in college composition and in the new literacies movement elsewhere. In any event, out of caution, when we first started running regional conferences in Santa Barbara in 2002, we framed the topic to straddle practice and research, but to our surprise our first iteration in 2002 turned out to draw nation ally and doubled our attendance expectation at around 150. So, in 2005 we framed the conference nationally and on writing research, though modestly as writing research in the making. Again we doubled expectation, at around 350, and drew internationally. This suggested to us that there was something serious going on, as there was, and so in 2008 we created an international conference. Inviting interest in all age levels and all methods. We drew around 600, representing over 30 nations.
There.
In 2011 we drew around 700 from over 40 nations to the conference at George Mason University, and founded the International Society for the Advancement of Writing Research in order to carry on the conference under global societal auspices and to carry on other activities. Membership now numbers close to 1,000. Through this and other conferences that are mentioned below, I have become aware of the variety of work going on globally. What follows is my idiosyncratic impressions of what is going on in different regions. I am sure there are many counterexamples to be cited. For a half a century, a strong applied linguistic research tradition has emanated from the Britain and Australia, in large part motivated by the teaching of English as an additional language and English for specific purposes, ESP. This work has been global in its influence, and research along these lines has been done in many regions, and many different languages have been studied. This strain of work has looked at linguistic forms, from the micro to the macro level, from a functionalist perspective, as resources for expression. In Europe, writing research started to heat up in the 1990s, with the first meeting of SIG writing in 1988 in Padova, Italy, and its 13th conference in 2012 in Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirocast.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?mark.id =11437114. Created from Humboldt on September 7, 2022, 2231. Copyright 2013. Taylor and Francis Group, 22 Charles Bazerman. Porto, Portugal. In recent years this organization has brought together a stable core of around 150 to 200 researchers from across Europe, with growing number bears from elsewhere. The organization is a special interest group of the European Association for Research on Learning and Instruction, early, and the traditions it draws on have been focused on psychology and education, but include higher education as well as primary and secondary education. The psychological work done in North America has had some influence on European activities, but European workers also have their own traditions that have grown out of phenomenography, emergent literacy, linguistic cognition, and other educational and psychological traditions. During the last decade, research in writing in Brazil has centered on the concept of genre, and the biannual International Symposium on Genre Stud IES, SIGET, has become the main site for presenting writing research, though this subject also receives some attention at applied linguistics meetings. Genre is identified as an educational priority in the Brazilian national curricular parameters for elementary and secondary schools, but the concept has also gained force in higher education and has come to stand for the kinds of things students should be writing. The genre and applied linguistics worlds are quite eclectic, drawing on multiple traditions, including Anglo-Australian applied linguistics and ESP and North American genre theory, but also Swiss-French educational investigations of genre, drawing on Vygotsky, other European educational traditions, and French literary theory. One of the leading approaches is grounded in the philosophy of language, Marcacci, 2001. But all of these are bound together in a uniquely Latin American Freirean interest in the everyday world and power relations, with a concern for social justice, Freire, 1970. Elsewhere in Latin America there is emerging interest in higher education writing, with a focus on graduate, student and research writing, to support the development of intellectual leaders and international scholars, but again with a continuing concern for social justice and the needs of minority and poor populations. Argentina, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico are at the forefront of this work. In China there are two separate writing worlds that are just becoming aware of each other. One of these is English, based on English as a foreign language, EFL, with a strong interest in ESP, academic and scientific writing, and drawing on applied linguistics, but with an expanding view into social context and purpose. The other is L1 Chinese writing, which still draws heavily on the ancient literary canon and standards of style. Interest in genres, functions, and situations of writing is also divided by language, with a special focus on English language in scientific and technical writing. This interest in research writing, often associated with English, seems to motivate much research in many parts of the world, often starting with applied linguistic investigations with an expansion of perspective as issues of context and communicative expression grow. It is curious that much of writing research globally is focused on higher education, except primarily in Europe where there is a Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Copyright Global and Local Communicative Networks and Implications for Literacy 23. Good spread across all age groups. In the USA, given the large higher education world of practice, one would expect much research at that level. Less research at the lower grades may have to do with the conflation of literacy with reading and with the development of what practice there is through the National Writing Project being largely outside the world of research. The recent addition of writing in school assessment has motivated some research, but much of it is limited and focused by the particular terms of assessment. There is, nonetheless, some strong ethnographic work in the primary and secondary world. In the rest of the world where there are few sites of higher education writing support and few teachers of writing in higher education, the focus on higher education writing is indeed worth noting. The focus on higher education, particularly in an EFL context, speaks to the large perceived need, plus the neglect of attempting to develop a deep and principled understanding of writing beyond the development of basic transcription skills, which often relies on traditional methods and beliefs. The one bright spot in early childhood and early education research for more than 3 decades has been the emergent literacy tradition. This has been truly an international movement, with major research produced in Latin America, North America, Europe, and the Middle East. These various traditions are now becoming more aware of each other through conferences and publications, particularly handbooks that have appeared in the past 5 years. Whereas 6 years ago there were no handbooks or reference books devoted exclusively to writing research, today there are at least 4 published, some with a deeply international perspective, and several more on the way. The journals and books also are becoming more international, as publications in Europe, Latin America, and North America are soliciting and receiving more international submissions. There are also several major initiatives that are expanding capacity in Europe and Latin America. Final comments. As educators we work within national educational systems within the national language of schooling, yet our students are increasingly international and multilingual in complex ways, as are their likely careers and the forces that will affect their lives. These complexities intersect local and global institutions and activity systems, through media that permeate national barriers and create the locales at which people now write. This is the world we are educating for. The richness of institutions depends on maintaining multiple complex strands of communicative activity that move across languages, with institutions able to counterpoise each other. The real danger of flatness is that the financially motivated communicative systems in a single disciplinary and national language will wash over all other systems and languages. Money and finances are strong motivators and create the resources for strong action. But if money talking overwhelms all other discourses, leaving the rest of the world flat, guided by the mountains of wealth, then we. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirocast.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?mark.id =1143714. Created from Humboldt on September 7, 2022, 22:31 and 58 seconds. Cop 24 Charles Bazerman. Really are in trouble. Governance in a democratic spirit without the dominance of strong imperial nations is a complex affair, requiring communication, cooperation, and coordination at many levels and in many venues. It is our rewarding and challenging task to help people learn to express and recognize in their writing the great complexity of humanity, with all its desires, needs, knowledge, and visions carried in the many languages of the world.
Shit, I'm about to die.
References. Anderson, B. 1983. Forms of Nationhood. London, UK, Verso. Bazerman, C. 1994. Systems of Genre and the Enactment of Social Intentions. In A. Friedman and P. Medway, eds, Genre and the New Rhetoric, pages 79 to 101. London, UK, Taylor and Francis. Bazerman, C. 2011. Electrons are cheap, society is dear. In D. Stark-Me Earring, A. Pear, and Artemeva, M. Horn, and L. Yusubova, eds, writing in...
Oh shit. Oh my god! How many references do we have?
3. Translingual Literacy in
There we go.
Matters of Agency. Min-Jean Liu and Bruce Horner. In this chapter we examine how a translingual approach to the teaching of writing would address matters of agency in all writing, including not only writing that appears to deviate from language norms, but also writing that appears simply to reproduce language norms. For a variety of reasons, those arguing for a translingual approach have been concerned primarily with the agency of those producing writing that appears to deviate from language norms. Point 1, for example, the call Horner, Liu, Royster, and Trim.
Hold up. For a variety of reasons, those arguing for a translingual approach have been concerned primarily with the agency of those producing writing that appears to deviate from language norms. Ooh.
Trimber, 2011, made recently for taking a translingual approach to writing is framed not in terms of language in writing but language difference in writing. And some approaches aligned with the translingual approach have argued that we should not require students to code switch, that is, to use only the code deemed appropriate to a particular situation, but instead to code mesh, that is, to mix codes within individual utterances. Kanagaraja, 2006, Young, 2009, Young and Martinez, 2011. Point 2, these efforts have developed as a response to dominant tendencies to reject any writing that appears to deviate from conventional language use. Those tendencies assume such deviations to represent writer deficit, assign that the writers lack linguistic, cognitive, or even moral competence. Against such assumptions, scholars have demonstrated the legitimacy of deviations as evidence of writers' linguistic capacity, intelligence, effort, and agency. However, in defending the production of recognizable difference in writing, these efforts have inadvertently led to identification of writerly agency only with the production of recognizably different writing. To disrupt this identification of agency only with production of recognizably different writing, we first outline a translingual framework for grasping the agency in all.
And they're like, you are just a morally bad person. Like, what the fuck?
All language use. This framework sees writing, writer identity, language forms used, and writer competence as always emergent, and hence writer agency as literacy as translingual practice, between communities and classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, Copyright, Translingual Literacy and Matters of Agency 27. both always in operation and always in development as writers shape themselves in language forms through recontextualization. This framework enables us to recognize writer agency in writing that reiterates standardized forms as well as in writing that deviates from such forms. Both, we argue, can be understood as involving choices made in particular situations and in light of particular purposes. Rather than asking whether writers should code switch or code mesh, a translingual approach asks us to consider how, when, where, and why specific language strategies might be deployed. This approach thus offers a more promising avenue for pedagogies aimed at helping writers to respond to what appear to be reader expectations and demands. Defining a translingual approach. For the purposes of our argument, the following tenets are key to grasping a translingual approach. Language as a dynamic process of structuration, reading, writing as integrally related acts of translation, transformation, relations between language users, and the temporal, spatial contexts and consequences of language acts as co-constitutive. A translingual approach treats language as a dynamic process of structuration. The term social theorist Giddens uses to mark the mutually dependent and co-constitutive relationship between structure and agency. As Giddens, 1979, states, the structural properties of social systems are both the medium and the outcome of the practices that constitute those systems. p. 69. Following Giddens' theory of structuration, a translingual approach locates language codes or structures temporally, in history, and hence understands these as always emergent, in process. Adopting a frame that is temporal, spatial, rather than just spatial, counters the long-standing tendency to treat languages as discrete, self-evident entities belonging to set territories, such as the nation, school, or home. That tendency, we argue, leads to impoverished debates aimed at pinning down the structure of individual languages and the social boundaries for their use. Pennycook, 2010, p. 82, cf. Francois, 2009. That tendency is manifested in such concepts as variety, code, bilingualism, mother tongue, borrowing, and appropriate. By contrast, a translingual approach defines languages not as something we have or have access to but as something we do. It centers attention on languaging, how we do language and why. At the same time, however, this approach insists on locating language use in the material social realm. Reading and writing, for example, are understood as social, economic, geopolitical, and cultural, as well as linguistic transactions across asymmetrical relations of power. In such transactions, meaning is necessarily and always the product of translation across differences, even in ostensibly monolingual. Literacy as translingual practice, between communities and classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group. Copyright Cop 28 Min John Liu and Bruce Horner. Goal settings. And because these rewritings involve relations of power, individual language practices are understood as negotiations that have the effect of forming and transforming their contexts, the identities of the participants, and their relations with each other, others, and the world. The relations between language users, and the contexts of language acts are thus seen as co-constitutive. Just as language is seen as always emerging from interactions rather than preceding these, in a translingual approach, contexts are likewise understood as always emergent, exerting pressure on but also being actively shaped and reshaped by individual language practices. Writers can thus be seen not as writing in a language or context but always writing, or rewriting, language and context with each writing. And thus, from a translingual perspective, those whose utterances are commonly recognized as either code meshing or code switching are not so much writing within, switching between, or mixing pre-existing codes. Instead, they are seen as bringing these, and the contexts of their use, into being through their utterances. Culture, ethnicity, nationality, race, geography, and environments are likewise seen as emerging in performance, informing and informed by individual acts of speaking, listening, reading, writing. In a translingual approach, reading and writing are understood as actively producing texts worlds and the very languages employed in asymmetrical relations of power are understood as both mediated by as well as mediating transformed by and transforming individual instances of languaging. By foregrounding the mutual interdependence of structure and language practices, a translingual approach shifts attention to matters of agency, the ways in which individual language users fashion and refashion standardized.
Every time she says languaging, I'm not talking about the author, I'm talking about the screen reader. But every time she says languaging, I'm just like, I imagine, because there was like the huge debacle over queering. Like, people are using the word queering. Like, we're queering couches because we're, getting colorful couches, right? And people got really, really pissed off about the idea of people using that. So now I'm just imagining, like, linguists who are really pissed off because people are languaging things in articles. And, like, that's really fucked up. Which, like, totally seems like something that, I mean, at least the linguists that I have interacted with get mad about. But anyway.
Standardized norms, identity, the world, and their relation to others in the world. And by foregrounding the specificity of the temporal context of individual instances of language practice from moment to moment, writers are seen not in terms of their degree of proximity, mastery, or adjustment to dominant definitions of exigent, feasible, appropriate, and stable contexts or codes, but as always responding to and shaping these. In response to calls for taking such a translingual approach, we have persistently encountered two vocal concerns. First, what about students' desire and need to know how to produce grammatically correct texts? The assumption appears to be that acknowledging student writers' agency in shaping language inevitably means dismissing dominant expectations that they produce something understood as standard English, the need and desire of students to meet these expectations, and the responsibility of teachers to help them do so. Thus, it appears to threaten students' potential academic and socio-economic success. This is a threat that seems especially troublesome when directed at socially and academically marginalized students. Second, and conversely, teachers question whether a translingual approach to language is relevant for those students who appear to fit cultural norms of language, race, class, ethnicity, and so on. While a translingual approach to language might be interesting, and even useful, for students not fitting these. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2000, Copyright, Translingual Literacy and Matters of Agency 29. Norms. It can seem to have little to do with the abilities, needs, and desires of students identified as mainstream, native English-speaking monolinguals. Hence both the approach and the students for whom it appears likely to be relevant are dismissed as simultaneously exotic and unimportant, and in either case peripheral to the mainstream of the work of writing programs and their constituents. In response to these concerns, we argue that, while the need of students to meet readers' expectations and the responsibility of teachers to help them do so are legitimate, the sense that a translingual approach would interfere with these is misguided, based on the false assumption that agency manifests itself only in recognized deviations from the norm rather than in all language acts. For example, some writers appear to assume that taking a translingual approach to language would require that students engage in code meshing, and that they avoid code switching in their writing, and that they avoid producing writing that appears to simply reproduce standardized conventions of syntax, notation, register, and organization. In other words, they assume that writers exercise agency only by code meshing. However, from our perspective, taking a translingual approach does not prescribe the forms of writing that students are to produce. Instead, it calls on students, and their teachers, to develop specific dispositions toward languages, language users, contexts, and consequences of language use, and the relations between all these, and to do so in all their engagements with reading and writing. By recognizing writers' agency and responsibility for all their language productions, whether these seem to reproduce standardized forms of writing or deviate from them, it is applicable and of benefit to all students, and all writers, including those deemed mainstream monolinguals and those deemed multilinguals. To foreground the agency and responsibility of writers in all acts of composition, those taking a translingual approach need to accompany work that foregrounds the agency operating in deviations from the norm with work that foregrounds the agency operating in seeming reproductions of the norm. As we have already suggested, a rich body of scholarship and teaching has developed out of the need to demonstrate the logic and legitimacy of language practices deviating from what is thought to be standard written English and to defend the rights and intelligence of the groups affiliated with those practices against charges that their writing shows their cognitive immaturity, ignorance, and laziness. Point 3 Those involved in these efforts include teacher scholars of students identified as basic writers and speakers of varieties of English deemed non-standard, teacher scholars of second language writing and ESL, and teacher scholars concerned with programs advancing multilingualism, Garcia, 2009, Cramsch, 1998, Marconi and Pennycook, 2007, Pennycook, 2008, and the use of world Englishes and English as a global lingua franca, Kanagaraja, 2006, Jenkins, 2006, Kirkpatrick, 2007. Seidlhofer, 2004. Point 4 These efforts are still ongoing and are still necessary, especially at a time in the United States when language difference has become a proxy target for discrimina. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Pennycook, 2007, Pennycook, 2008, and the use of World English Literacy as Translingual Copyright 230 Min Jean Liu and Bruce Horner. Shin against subordinated populations. However, the focus of much of this work on language use is perceived to be different, and of the agency of those engaging in such uses, has had the unintended consequence of leaving the impression that writers' production of conventional language shows a lack of agency, the subordination of the individual will to institutional demands, say, or unwitting, unagentive mechanical reproduction of language norms. To counter this impression, we need a fully articulated account of agency in writing that seems to merely repeat or imitate standardized forms and meanings. To develop such an account, we turn to Pennycook's 2010 notion of the sedimentation of language. In his book Language as a Local Practice and Elsewhere, Pennycook has argued for the need to treat language not as a set of pre-existing rules but as an achieved outcome of the everyday doing of language by ordinary people, 2010, p. 115. To account for the appearance of language as a set of fixed forms and rules, he has introduced the notion of the sedimentation of language. That process of language sedimentation of building up, over time produces the appearance of language stability, Pennycook, 2010, p. 125. For example, in this view, grammar is the name for certain categories of observed repetitions in language practices, Pennycook. Pennycook.
To account, he's introduced the notion of sedimentation of language. Ooh, sedimentation of language. Crap. There we go. That process of language sedimentation, building up over time, produces the appearance of language stability. For example, in his view, grammar is the name for certain categories of observed repetition in language practices. Ooh, oof. Oh my god. Oh my god. That's fun. The Oxford comma. The Oxford comma. Yeah. People are only doing it because everybody else is doing it. If all of your like writer friends jumped off of a cliff, would you do it too? Exactly, you wouldn't. So don't use an Oxford comma. Only doing it because your friends are doing it.
Pennycook,
Don't do
2010, p46. The imagery of sedimentation highlights the temporal dimension of context, language, and identity, recognizing their character as emergent products of movement and memory rather than being timeless systems and structures. Pennycook, 2010, p125. Invoking the proverb that we never step into the same river twice, Pennycook has asked us to consider the possibility of simultaneous sameness and difference, or what, borrowing from Homi Bhabha, is termed fertile mimesis. Pennycook, 2010, p35. From this perspective we can recognize that what is commonly viewed as doing the same thing again in fact represents doing something different. That which we do is both the same and different, just as the river is and is not the same, and just as we ourselves and our actions are and are not the same when we step, seemingly again, into a river. Point 5 Key to grasping the process of fertile mimesis is the notion of recontextualization. It is that recontextualization that makes it possible for ostensibly identical utterances to carry significantly different meanings and significance in different contexts. These include differences, or changes, in meaning, semiodiversity, and differences in the meaning and order of power relations as we recontextualize linguistic patterns such as a standardized lexicogrammatical code across time and space. As post-colonial theories have taught us, mimicry of dominant powers, arts, discourses, and colonizers by the subordinate creates new meanings and new relationships between colonized and colonizer, with the potential to undermine the status and distinction of the dominant. Pennycook, 2010, p44, cf. Babha, 1985, Pratt, 1991. The notion of the inevitable recontextualization of ostensibly the same brings out the degree to which every instance of the use of language, including what is recognized as repetition, represents an exercise of agency, a choice, whatever. Literacy as translingual practice, between communities and classrooms, copyright Translingual Literacy and Matters of Agency 31. The level of consciousness in the making of it. As Giddens, 1979, puts it, every instance of the use of language is a potential modification of that language at the same time as it acts to reproduce it. p. 220. The specific differences between temporal, spatial and micro contexts of individual instances of imitation recontextualize and hence reform the very feature or meaning we appear to borrow from, our own and others, previous instances of language use, which themselves represent socially and historically sediment patterns of linguistic resources. Pennycook, 2010, p. 45.6. In this sense, the apparent regularity of language and grammar is the achievement of recontextualization or reforming that participates in the ongoing sedimentation of language practices. Furthermore, as Pennycook, 2010, observes, we can make intentional changes to what we do, and these changes may themselves become sediment over time. p. 49. Even small, unintentional slippages, changes to the ways we do and say things, may start to be repeated and become sediment practices when social, cultural, and economic reasons for change recur as demands to be addressed in instances of language acts. Pennycook, 2010, p. 49. And this sedimentation as a result of fertile mimesis affects the formation of not only language but also our subjectivities, life trajectories, the world.
What is mimesis? I think that's like just mimicry. I think mimesis is just doing... Let's look it up. Mimesis, representation or imitation of the real world in art and literature. Okay, so like there's this idea that you can't change the world through art. And to an extent, I would agree. Does life imitate art or does art imitate life? Well, art imitates life because art is created by people who are alive. And art is a reflection of the experiences, the knowledge of people who are alive. It's the same with writing, which, believe it or not, is a form of art because you're, creating little symbols that mean things, which is what art is. Symbols that mean things. Yeah. Kind of crazy how everything is everything else. But anyway. So yeah, fertile mimesis affects the formation not only of language, but also our subjectivities, life trajectories, and the world we live in. Yeah, that's what I just said. And our relationships with others in the world. Yeah, that's what I just said. I just said that. Like, better. Let's keep going. Oh, fuck. Did I cancel the read aloud?
Part I.
Read aloud? Oh, God!
Standardized forms yields as a
Not again.
30.
No. Where are you going with that? I just totally fucked it up. Here we go.
River is and is not the same, and just as we ourselves and our actions are and are not the same when we step, seemingly again, into a river. Point 5 Key to grasping the process of fertile mimesis is the notion.
No, that's not it. That's before it. What the fuck? Okay, in response, consistently encountered or what about students? What? No. Where? Why? Oh my god! Is there a way? No, there isn't. I don't care about that. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Wait, that's where I was. That's where I was.
Notion of recontextualization. It is that recontextualization that makes it possible for ostensibly identical utterances to carry significantly different meanings and significance in different contexts. These include differences, or changes, in meaning, semiotiversity, and differences in the meaning and order of power relations as we recontextualize linguistic patterns such as a standardized lexicogrammatical code across time and space. As post-colonial theories have taught us, mimicry of dominant powers, arts, discourses, and colonizers by the subordinate creates new meanings and new relationships between colonized and colonizer, with the potential to undermine the status and distinction of the dominant. Pennycook, 2010, p. 44, cf. Babha, 1985, Pratt, 1991. The notion of the inevitable recontextualization of ostensibly the same brings out the degree to which every instance of the use of language, including what is recognized as repetition, represents an exercise of agency, a choice, whatever. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirocas.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?mark.id =1143714. Created from Copyright Translingual Literacy in Matters of Agency 31. The level of consciousness in the making of it. As Giddens, 1979, puts it, every instance of the use of language is a potential modification of that language at the same time as it acts to reproduce it. p. 220.
Every instance of the use of language is a potential modification of that language at the same time as it acts to reproduce it. Ooh. Specific differences between temporal, spatial, and macro-micro contexts of individual instances of imitation recontextualized and hence reform the very feature or meaning we appear to borrow from our own or others' previous instances of language use, which themselves represent socially and historically sedimented patterns of linguistic resources. Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! Where do we start? I'm thinking. I may need a moment. This is good. We have, micro context. So micro context would be like, you're saying, you know, what do you want? What do you want? What are you looking for? When you say sup to somebody, right? You're not actually asking them what's up. We generally recognize when somebody says sup that you're like saying what's up. But at the same time, you don't expect an answer. It's just, that's the greeting. Right? Okay. It's micro context. Macro context. Macro context. Let's see. I'm trying to think of like a big event that, you know, happened. Words, things. The slap. You know what I'm talking about. The slap. I don't particularly have a take on the slap. I don't care. But like, I say that, and you know what I mean. You know what I'm talking about. Now, before the slap, when you said the slap, people will be like, what the fuck are you talking about, right? Because it doesn't mean anything. But now it means something. So, macro event. Or macro context. So they recontextualize and reform the feature or meaning we appear to borrow from previous instances of language use. Now, this also includes, like, when an author is writing a book, right? And you're reading the book. And then the fandom is interpreting the book. And everybody in the fandom is, like, arguing with each other because that's not what the author meant. Or this is what the author meant. Or I don't care what the author meant because it doesn't matter what the author meant. Okay? All these different things that are occurring are instances, are context of individual instances of invitation. Recontextualizing meaning. Right? We're recontextualizing meaning. We're saying, I read this and my experiences inform me that this means this. A person who does not consume media, who lives in a log cabin in the Arctic Circle, is going to be like, I have no idea what the fuck a slap is. Well, they probably know what a slap is, but they don't know what the slap is, right? But you do. So, we are recontextualizing, we are reforming, we are changing. Language is always changing. New meanings are being formed at some point in time. I really need to, like, pause this. That frog's getting close to me. At some point in time, the words that we use now did not have the meanings they do now. They had different meanings, and they gained those meanings. And the meanings piled and piled up until the point at which the language seemed completely different from what it is now. That's why, you know, that's why the kids who said, I bite my thumb at you after Shakespeare week in high school, why we all think those kids are hella cringe. Like, what the fuck are you doing, dude? What? You're biting your thumb? I don't understand that context. Now we just say fuck you. I don't know. It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad as take goes.
Specific differences between temporal, spatial, and micro contexts of individual instances of imitation recontextualize and hence reform the very feature or meaning we appear to borrow from our own and others' previous instances of language use, which themselves represent socially and historically sediment patterns of linguistic resources. Pennycook, 2010, p. 45.6. In this sense, the apparent regularity of language and grammar is the achievement of recontextualization or reforming that participates in the ongoing sedimentation of language practices. Furthermore, as Pennycook, 2010, observes, we can make intentional changes to what we do, and these changes may themselves become sediment over time. p. 49. Even small, unintentional slippages, changes to the ways we do and say things, may start to be repeated and become sediment practices when social, cultural, and economic reasons for change recur as demands. Oh, here we go. Small, unintentional slippages, changes to the way we do and say things. So like, you ever been in the community or on the stream, watching the stream of a major streamer or how about this, Hassan? You've ever been watching Hassan and he says things and they're like, better idea. Why do some people call Hassan Azan? Right? Okay, and I'm gonna be hella cringe and like make a lot of references to Hasanabi because like this is like, you know, it's weird, but okay. I remember I am a master's student. I am doing a project on you know, streamers, and it's all about, you know, different streamers. Maybe eventually I will gather more streamers into my little, you know,
bubble of master's project. But at this point, we have a very narrow focus. Okay, we got a narrow focus. Just roll with it. Okay, so where was I? Small, unintentional slippages. So nobody knows how to say this guy's name. Changes to the way we do and say things may start to be repeated and become sedimented practices when social, culture, and economic reasons for change occur. So social and cultural reasons for change. So people are saying his name wrong, right? Some people think it's funny. They start saying his name wrong. Next thing you know, the whole entire community goes online. Is like, I like to watch Azan. Right? Okay, that's what's happening. But like with normal boring words too. It's cool. It's good stuff. It's,
Demands to be addressed in instances of land gauge acts. Pennycook, 2010, p. 49. And this sedimentation as a result of fertile mimesis affects the formation of not only language but also our subjectivities, life trajectories, the world we live in, and our relations with others in that world. The theory of agency and iteration outlined above suggests ways.
Our relations with others. What does that mean? The communities that we inhabit. Not just, in real life, your neighbor. You don't really share memes with your neighbor. But you sure as shit share memes with, your fellow community members in the fandom or the fan club or in the Discord. You do. You're sharing them memes. And then the memes become a part of your day-to-day language. Poggers, right? And they become a way that you communicate with other people. Now, some people are going to be like, I'm only going to use poggers in the Twitch chat. But other people are out there saying poggers in their everyday life. And you might think, I don't know, man, that's hella cringe. I don't think I could do that. And I would be like, well, pog you then, dude. And maybe that's not a contextually appropriate way of using poggers. But at the same time, these small changes may become sedimented over time.
Ways by which we might refine dominant frameworks for understanding and responding to student writing. Adopting a temporal, spatial frame for understanding discourse enables us to recognize writers' participation in the ongoing sedimentation of ways of thinking, talking, reading, writing, acting, and relating in all their discourse productions. Within such a framework, iterations of discourse can be recognized as acts of fertile mimesis that, inevitably, produce semiotiversity through recontextualization. Such recognition enables teachers and students to use iterations of discourse as sites for probing options and making decisions on how to...
Recontextualization means there is context. Then we change the context, and there's new meaning. Okay, let's keep going.
To recontextualize existing norms and why, and to do so in light of the specificity of the temporal, spatial and macro contexts of their writing. Adopting a translingual approach enables us to recognize agency...
I'm going to keep saying this, but remember, you got any questions, you got any comments, you got any concerns, please ask them. I will answer. You have the questions. I do not have the answers, but I will approximate an answer for you to any question. There are no bad questions. There are no bad requests. There are only the endless pit of eternal doom that I will launch you in if you're...
Even in the production of the most seemingly cliched, resolutely conventional writing. Traditional spatial frameworks give teachers few options for responding to such writing. If we understand such writing as mechanical reproduction, we appear to have little to do except attempt to cajole students to do something different, or wait for them to develop cognitively to the point at which they can do something different, hear something understood as doing more than reproduce the conventional. Paradoxically, those frameworks perpetuate the before-after model that also supports dismissing the agency of student writers whose writing seems to deviate significantly from conventionalized discourse, either persuade the students to do something different.
Paradoxically, those frameworks perpetuate the before-after model that also supports dismissing the agency of student writers, whose writing seems to deviate significantly from the conventionalized discourse, either persuade the students to do something different, form the norms, with them to develop cognitively or linguistically to the point where they are able to do something different. In their case, however, something more or other less conventional. What? Traditional spatial frameworks give teachers few options for responding to such writing. Adopting a translingual approach enables us to recognize the agency. Okay, so a spatial framework. What's a spatial framework? What they were talking about before. If we understand writing as mechanical reproduction, we appear to have little to do except attempts to cajole students to do something different or wait for them to develop cognitively to the point where they can do something different. I don't know about that. Have you ever thought about engaging people with their ideas rather than
temporal, spatial, and macro contexts of their writing?
Shit.
Adopting a translingual approach enables us to recognize agency even in the production of the most seemingly cliched, resolutely conventional writing. Traditional spatial frameworks give teachers few options for responding to such writing. If we understand such writing as mechanical reproduction, we appear to have little to do except attempt to cajole students to do something different, or wait for them to develop cognitively to the point at which they can do something different, here something understood as doing more than reproduce the conventional. Paradoxically, those frameworks perpetuate the before-after model that also supports dismissing the agency of student writers whose writing seems to deviate significantly from conventionalized discourse, either persuade the students to do something different, conform to norms, or wait for them to develop cognitively or linguistically, to the point where they are able to do something different in their case. However,
we're gonna have quick burp because I have to help somebody with technical difficulties. Technical difficulties are the worst kinds of difficulties because everyone seems to have them. And they are inescapable because we live in an increasingly technical world. Play Store. Yep, it's that first one. Okay. What? Okay, where was I? Reading Rainbow. Just this week. Oh yeah. Oh shit! Fuck! I'm about to die! No! Do not die! Do not die! We're dying. We are so dead. We are deader than a doornail. Fuck this frog. I really should pause the game when I'm reading, but I keep forgetting to, and it's not good. It's bad. There we go. I mean, look, if you play the Viscera game, you can just pause whenever. Anyway, let's keep going.
However, something more, rather than less, conventional. Thus a purely spatial conceptual framework, in which each language has a literacy as translingual practice, between communities and classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirocast.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?mark.id =1143714. Created from Humboldt on September 7, 2022, 22:31 and 58 seconds. Copyright 232 Min Jean Liu and Bruce Horner. Central core belonging to a social space or people, with peripheral deviations, seems to doom both those barricaded in the center and those consigned to the periphery. By contrast, the temporal, spatial framework of a translingual approach identifies both apparently all too conventional writing as well as unconventional writing as acts contributing to the ongoing sedimentation of language. By recognizing the agency exhibited in the production of what seems to be the same, this approach can help students recognize and exercise their agency in how they do and might actively recontextualize sediment features of English in ways that help them better grasp, respond to, and reshape the temporal, spatial, micro contexts of their past, current, and future lives. By asking students to explore not what to do and not do, but how they are doing English and why, we put them in a position to probe their responsibility in using the linguistic commons that currently constitutes English as a putative global link across different peoples, cultures, and languages. In doing so, we can engage the agency of not just students in writing designated mainstream, and not just those designated as outside that mainstream, but both. Engaging all forms of agency. To further illustrate what engaging the agency of all student writers might entail, we turn to an early example of what we would identify as translingual pedagogy and its critical reception, Liu's 1994 article Professing Multiculturalism, and Kanagaraja's discussion of Liu's article in his own 2006 article The Place of World Englishes in Composition, Pluralization Continued, both appearing in the journal College Composition and Communication. Liu's article described a class discussion in which she asked students to perform a close reading of several papers written by a first-year undergraduate writing student from Malaysia whose native language is Chinese, p. 451. We'll refer to this student as Writer M. In her papers, Writer M had used the construction can able to bring out the difference in definitions of can to mean having the ability to and having permission to, a difference she felt was overlooked in idiomatic use of can to signify both. During the discussion of Writer M's papers, students were asked to Consider ways to make sense of can able to against the grain of their trained disposition to dismiss the construction as a grammatical error resulting from writer M's unfamiliarity with idiomatic English, and to consider whether and how they would revise can able to in light of writer M's critique of dominant beliefs in the transcendental power of the individual, and in light of the specific contexts of each student's life. As argued by both Lu and, subsequently, Nagaraja in his comments.
To the stream. We are about halfway through. I'm about to be eaten by, or halfway through the reading. I'm about to be eaten by a spider. I can hear them snarling at me. I gotta, like, actually take care of these spiders, but I keep pausing, and getting almost killed by them. But anyway, let's get back to the reading.
Comments. What seems key about the production of constructions such as can able to is not the construction itself.
Feel free to, feel free to ask questions, share comments, ask me to adjust the settings, whatever you need.
But whether or not students engage in a process of negotiation and deliberation in deciding whether or not to produce such a construction or a more conventional construction. However, because both Lu and Kanagaraja's Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBooks, copyright to Translingual Literacy and Matters of Agency 33. Essays foreground writer agency operating in the production of writing that appears to deviate from the norms of standard written English. Their attention to agency operating in the iteration of standardized forms of writing is likely to be glossed over. Conversely, the notion of language sedimentation and recontextualization can help us recognize such agency, as when a student of Lu's, identified as Vietnamese American, decided to opt for the idiomatic convention of using can and be able to interchangeably. Lu has defended this decision not as a submission to demands of the dominant, but rather in terms of the connotations of agency associated with such treatment of can and able to, connotations that inspired modes of resistance and individual empowerment against the fatalism of the student's own community, pages 454 to 455. Kanagaraja has likewise emphasized the legitimacy of this student's decision to choose a standard grammar structure, arguing that such a decision can become an ideologically favored option for a minority student. 2006, p. 610. Thus, Kanagaraja has joined Lu in affirming the agency operating in all the decisions different students arrived at, including decisions to follow conventional usage. To these arguments, Kanagaraja, 2006, has made the further point that there are additional pedagogical benefits.
Hold on. What was happening? Likewise, emphasize the legitimacy of the student's decision to choose a standard grammar structure, arguing that such a decision can become an ideologically favored option for a minority student. Thus, Kanagaraja has joined Lu in affirming the agency operating in all the decisions different students arrived at, including decisions to follow conventional usage. Okay, so, like, it's okay if we decide to use conventional English. It's also okay if we don't.
Benefits to all students of discussing grammatical deviations like can able to, including 1. Helping students to develop a metalinguistic awareness of the values and interests motivating grammar rules and decisions on how to use them, and 2. Enabling students to use grammar meaningfully, rather than opting for stereotypical choices, p. 610. To this point, we would add that the goal of enabling students to use grammar meaningfully can also be achieved by discussing seeming iterations of conventional discourse. For example, in the class discussion Lu described, we can see students, both monolingual and multilingual, exhibiting agency and an interest as well as know-how in exercising that agency through their labor as writers and their suggestions about ways to revise writer M's idiosyncratic construction. Some of these students suggested adding an if clause to be able to, as in if the person is able to. Likewise, when, as Lu recounted, the phrase can able to became a newly coined phrase she and the students shared throughout the term, 1994, p. 454, we see both the exercise of agency and, as Kanagaraja, 2006, has observed, a dramatization of the process by which certain cases of peculiar usage become standardized or, in terms of our argument, sediment once their meanings and purposes are socially shared, p. 610. This example of the student's active recontextualization of a feature in a previous instance of language practice by writer M indicates all writers' agency in iteration, not just those labeled minority and multilingual. In short, the metaphor of emerging sedimentation and the notion of fertile mimesis can help translingual research and pedagogy take seriously the political and rhetorical agency of repetition, identification, mimicry, and reproduction. Pennycook, 2010, p. 36, enabling teachers to complement their honoring of the agency exhibited in utterances recognizably different and transformative. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://copyright 34 Min John Lu and Bruce Horner. With an honoring of agency exhibited in students' production.
Agency, what? Okay. In short, the metaphor of emerging sedimentation and the notion of fertile mimesis can help translingual research and pedagogy take seriously the political and rhetorical agency of repetition, identification, mimicry, reproduction, enabling teachers to complement their honoring of the agency exhibited in utterances recognizably different and transformative with an honoring of agency exhibited in students' production of what is recognized as conventional or the same. Thus, our engagement with students' efforts to meet reader expectations for standardized forms of writing can work in tandem rather than at odds with engagement in pursuing the possibility of transforming forms of writers' and readers' expectations and demands. So, students are writing for an audience. And there are a lot of different audiences out there. So we, as teachers, have to try to understand the audiences that students are writing for. Yeah. Rather than pretend that there's just one audience, right? There's more than one audience. There's, the audience of Twitch viewers. There's the audiences of fellow students. There's the audience of the teachers. There's the audience of your 8-year-old cousin. I think my cousin's like 13 now. Anyway, there's a lot of different audiences. There's a lot of different exigencies, reasons for writing. There's a lot of different reasons why writers choose to write things, how they choose to write things, when they choose to write things, and where they choose to write things, and what they're choosing to write about. And we, as teachers, help students write what they want to write, say what they want to say, rather than telling them how to say it.
Production of what is recognized as conventional, or the same. Thus, our engagement with students' efforts to meet reader expectations for standardized forms of writing can work in tandem, rather than at odds, with engagement in pursuing the possibility of transforming forms of writing and readers' expectations and demands. The translingual approach's recognition of agency and iteration also provides a more useful perspective on efforts to help members of subordinated groups produce texts that meet expectations for standardized English. While these efforts are typically defended as a means of ensuring the survival of at-risk populations through submission to the demands of dominant groups, the translingual approach justifies and suggests a pedagogically more productive way to teach minority and multilingual students to produce standardized forms of English. Instead of asking them to engage in mechanical reproduction of forms the boundaries and stability of which are in fact questionable, it would ask students to explore ways by which they might engage in fertile mimesis and critical agency in recontextualizing all forms of English, including those recognized by some as standard and those not. For example, we can find ways to identify the semiodiversity that producing standardized forms yields as a...
Sometimes I forget to bring the chat back to the front when I switch over. So I'm on multiple tabs. Sometimes I forget to see the chat. But I'm working on it. I'm trying. Oh, I did not mean that. Oh my god! Stop that. I hear the spiders. Okay, we're good.
As a consequence of who is using what language forms when and how, its recontextualization, and the potential that recontextualization has for transforming the conditions in which the writers lie. Likewise, rather than present the iteration of standardized forms as simply the default or required code to which writers must submit, we can explore how both iterations of ostensibly the same and deviations from conventional usage can and need to be cued textually. In her 1994 essay, Liu noted, p. 454, that some students suggested using can able to with a parenthetical explanation or a footnote about the need for this unusual usage as strategy. Kanagaraja, 2006, subsequently observed, that represents a form of compromise as it acknowledges that the writer is aware of using the structure in a peculiar way for a unique rhetorical purpose and that iterates a valued convention of academic writing, p. 610. Namely the footnote. We can help students develop these and other strategies by which to persuade readers to respond with more tolerance to their texts as well as to imagine readers' anticipated difficulties with their writing. As we have suggested elsewhere, Horner and Liu, 2008, this involves teaching students not simply to identify expectations of their anticipated audience but also to propose alternative ways of reading for their readers to adopt. The standard pedagogical repertoire of many writing instructors already addresses ways of anticipating readers' expectations and responding to them, helping writers develop the habit of imagining, as they write and revise, the kinds of questions and difficulties various readers might have in responding to their work, and of deciding whether and how to accommodate these as they write by such means as addressing imagined questions, say, or adding explanations, or defining their terms, offering alternative phrasings, and contextualizing their Arguments all while recognizing the likelihood of remaining disagreements and literacy as translingual practice, between communities and classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor, copyright 2013, Translingual Literacy and Matters of Agency 35. Confusion over meaning.
How do you participate? Hold on a second. So, oh my god. In the chat. So if you like have question, I mean, if you wanted to actually, like talk, we could like do a Discord call or something, I guess. I'm not really like set up for that. But I mean, if you wanted to, we could try that. But yeah, like for like at the moment, yeah, just, you know, in the chat. I mean, yeah, and like I said, I'm trying to watch the chat better. So if you know, like if you have stuff to say, I'm definitely gonna like read it.
Carr, 2009, on ELF Strategies of Repair, Kana Garaja, 2011. Part of this work will entail helping writers learn to monitor the forms and conventions they encounter in the discourse of others, to assume their meaningfulness, and to consider ways in which they might adapt and adopt them in their own writing. See Kanagaraja, 2007, p. 927. And, part of this work will involve finding ways for writers to persuade readers to adopt more open, patient, and inquiring attitudes towards one's writing. If we accept that reading and writing are integrally related acts of translation, transformation, then taking a translingual approach must involve finding ways for teachers as well as students to listen against the grain of systems of reading privileging dominant groups and to explore alternative ways of reading. See Royster, 1996. We have argued that a translingual approach identifies the issue we face not as a question of whether to teach standardized forms and meanings but, rather, the need for all of us, in our reading and writing, to deliberate over how and why to do what with language in light of emergent and mutually constitutive relations of language, context, identity, and power relations. This requires a more fully articulated approach to the agency of acts of seeming repetition.
Hold on. We have argued that a translingual approach, pausing, identifies the issue we face not as a question of whether to teach standardized forms of meaning, but rather the need for us all in our reading and writing to deliberate over how and why to do what with language in the light of emerging and mutually constitutive relations of language, context, identity, and power relations. This requires a more fully articulated approach to the agency of acts of seeming repetition, one that recognizes the production of difference through temporal spatial recontextual. I cannot read this. Recontextualization of what might pass as the same. Okay.
Repetition, one that recognizes the production of difference through temporal, spatial recontextualization of what might pass as the same. That is, they need to learn to recognize, and help students learn to recognize, the production of the same in what appears to be different, the production of difference in what appears to be the same, and the agency operating in both. Adopting such an approach to agency can help teachers to address whatever positions students adopt, offering an alternative perspective on current disputes about the kind of language education we need. In short, a translingual approach to agency brings to the fore the ways in which all writing involves rewriting language, with all the possibilities and responsibilities that such rewriting entails. Notes. 1. The meaning of translingual, and variations such as translingualism, remains contested and competes with such terms.
Oh my god, notes and references. Let's go to the next one. Oh my god, there's so many references.
Rhetorical activities of global citizens.
Okay, this
Scott
one should be
Weibel.
interesting.
Dating back to at least ancient Greece, rhetoric scholars and teachers have sought, in the words of Isocrates, to develop in students the skills and knowledges that will enable them to govern wisely both their own households and the commonwealth, as cited in Atwill, 1998, p. 132. Such an education would help students to obtain a deep understanding of subjects related to civic life, such as the law, political philosophy, and ethics. Equally as important, this rhetorical education would give students practice in a broad range of strategies for deliberating with other citizens about public matters. And, finally, through such rhetorical education students ideally would be exposed to and learn to inhabit the culture's values, commonplaces, and worldviews. While there have been many notable exceptions throughout history for racialized, gendered, and disabled minorities, rhetorical education has, in short, aimed to prepare students to participate fully in public political life. These latter two aspects of rhetorical education, teaching a common set of communication strategies and fostering or preserving a sense of a common culture, draws on a political philosophy expressed most recently by philosophy scholar Kim Lakoff, 2001. While speaking specifically about democracies, Kim Lickaw stresses that a system of collective deliberation and legitimation demands that participants understand and trust one another, p. 212. Kim Lickaw suggests that such mutual understanding and trust requires some underlying commonalities, the two most important of which he believes to be sharing a common language and a common culture, p. 212. This political
system of collective deliberation and implementation demands that participants understand and trust one another. Mutual understanding and trust requires some underlying commonalities, language and culture. I don't know that. I don't know if I agree with that.
Political philosophy highlights two important, yet often implicit, assumptions underlying many theories and practices of rhetorical education. First, rhetorical education commonly orients itself toward public affairs conducted within a distinct political boundary, such as the Commonwealth of Isocrates' time or, in more recent centuries, the nation. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, Copyright 40 Scott Weibel. State. Second, rhetorical education often reinforces a belief that the success of the culture resides in a common language, as the use of a single language would seem to enable public deliberations to proceed as clearly and efficiently as possible. This chapter extends and complicates...
Okay, but the thing about common language is, we've already talked about, what's it called? Well, what did they call it? The way that language itself, the nature of language itself is translingual. Okay, so your understanding of, we can have people who speak the same language and use the same words, but have, and then the same exact sentences and phrases, but those sentences and phrases can have functionally different meanings to each of those people, even though they're from the same culture. They speak the same language, and they're using the same words and phrases. So it's not... Yeah, no. That's not how that works. That's not how that works. We can say that language is common, we have a common language, but just because we have a common language doesn't mean we have a common language. Because there's not just one standard English. There are many, it's the rewards or consequences thing. Would you rather have rewards or consequences? Sure, consequences can be rewards. Consequences can be a reward. But you'd rather have a reward than a consequence.
Complicates such an understanding of rhetorical edu cation by investigating the rhetorical practices that have developed within one group, the World Social Forum, to enable its participants to govern more wisely the affairs of contemporary globalization. For the past decade, the World Social Forum has arranged international and regional meetings to create space for social movements and activists from around the world to come together and deliberate collectively. Participants reflect on the causes and consequences of neoliberal globalization, share experiences of local challenges to present forms of globalization, develop and debate alternative proposals for global policies, and coordinate political actions across nation-state boundaries. The World Social Forum's participants maintain that another type of global world is possible, one created by and for the benefit of more than just the world's financial, political, and cultural leaders. A different rhetorical education. What is compelling about this group in terms of rhetorical education is that it strives to educate people from various linguistic and cultural communities to participate in global discussion. Traditional conceptions of public deliberation would suggest that such discussions would not be effective because the participants do not share a common culture or language. Structures have been created within the World Social Forum and its regional meetings, however, to enable people from a variety of language communities to participate in deliberations about globalization. These efforts to promote multilingual dialogue can serve as heuristics for thinking about what rhetorical education might look like when viewed through the lens of globalization. The Social Forum's practices prompts amendments, in the name of attending more closely to linguistic diversity, to central questions that have concerned scholars of rhetorical education: what language and rhetorical strategies do citizen activists promote to engage global and transnational conversations? What attitudes and values do individuals and groups develop through such engagement? What knowledge gets created through cross-cultural and cross-language deliberations, and toward what ends might this knowledge be used? This chapter aims to begin thinking through these questions about rhetorical education and the linguistic dimensions of global citizenship. Before turning to these two examples, a brief explanation is in order of the rationale for thinking about citizenship in relation to the global or transnational sphere, not just the commonwealth or nation-state. This rationale draws primarily on rhetoric scholar Asen's 2004 Discourse Theory of Citizenship. Asen argues that it is limiting to view citizenship as an identity simply granted to people by a nation-state. This perspective leads scholars to focus only on identifying what does and does not count as a civic act, voting, for example, or joining politically affili. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. Copyright, Rhetorical Activities of Global Citizens 41.
This perspective leads scholars to focus only on identifying what does and does not count as a civic act. Voting, for example, or joining politically affiliated organizations.
41. Aided organizations rather than also considering the contexts within which someone pursues a public activity and the dispositions of the person performing the act, pages 190 to 191. Asen maintains that it is the person's attitudes and aims that mark a public act as civic. Specifically, he suggests that acts of citizenship are marked by a person's desire to widen public agendas and invite greater participation, p. 199, to risk thinking differently and putting one's beliefs in the open, subject to criticism and revision, pages 199 to 200, to commit to interaction that privileges norms of inclusion and fairness, p. 201.
Acts of citizenship are marked by a person's desire to widen public agendas and invite greater participation, risk thinking differently, and putting one's beliefs in the open, subject to criticism and revision. Interaction that privileges norms of inclusion and fairness, to express oneself in creative ways, to be mindful of one's positioning and perspectives. So, like, the discourse theory of citizenship. The discourse theory of citizenship is that if you're doing things in a place, then you are a citizen of that place. Basically. I mean, that's what I'm reading here. That's what
pages
I'm reading
190
here.
To by a person's desire to widen public agendas and invite greater participation, p. 199, to risk thinking differently and putting one's beliefs in the open, subject to criticism and revision, pages 199 to 200, to commit to interaction that privileges norms of inclusion and fairness, p. 201, to express oneself in creative ways, p. 201, and to be mindful of one's positioning and perspectives relative to people situated differently, pages 202 to 203. Civic acts, then, are the means people use to forge connections with other individuals and groups in public, no matter the geographic or political scale. It is in this sense that one can think of the World Social Forum's multilingual activities as forms of global citizenship. This desire to expand participation and to recognize the perspectives of others lies at the heart of the World Social Forum's international and regional meetings. The World Social Forum was first held in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in April 2001, as an emergence from the anti-neoliberal globalization movement. Since that time, the forum's annual meetings have brought together activists and civil society organizations concerned with issues such as women's rights, agriculture and natural resources, global warming, HIV/AIDS, independent media, and economic equality. The forum is not a deliberative body, its participants do not debate and vote on policies that would be binding for all participating organizations and individuals. Instead, as the first principle of the World Social Forum's Charter of Principles, 2001, explains, the forum serves as an open meeting place for reflective thinking, democratic debate of ideas, formulation of proposals, free exchange of experiences, and interlinking for effective action, emphasis added. While Principle 1 defines the forum as a place, however, Principles 2 and 3 describe the forum as becoming a permanent process of seeking and building alternatives. And a world process, emphasis added. This emphasis on process is significant. It encourages one to read the forum's motto, another world is possible, not only in terms of the alternative models for global development and anti-global activism that might emerge from the World Social Forum meetings, but also the alternative processes of deliberation and decision-making enacted through the forum meetings themselves. Central to this process is the structure that has been created to enable face-to-face multilingual dialogue at the World Social Forum, as well as regional social forum meetings. In many sessions at the various social forum meetings, the floor is open for all participating groups to raise concerns and present ideas that they feel others need to give greater attention. Quite significantly, the participants in World Social Forum and regional social forum meetings are given the opportunity to speak in local languages, rather than one of the dominant international languages, should they choose to do so. What enables this multilingual dialogue? to work are the efforts of volunteer networks of translators, such as the group Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, Copyright Cop 42 Scott Weibel. Babbles, along with a radio-based digital interpretation technology developed by the media activist network Alternative Interpretation System. The participants in the regional preparatory meetings are given the opportunity to speak in local languages, rather than one of the dominant international languages, should they choose to do so. The World Social Forum has created this unique multilingual structure to promote values of fairness and equality. This policy ensures that people who have less experience in formal democratic dialogue, as well as PEO/PLE from historically marginalized groups and language backgrounds, have just as much opportunity as anyone else to contribute to the deliberations. Compared to monolingual political debates, these multilingual dialogues do not measure up by traditional evaluative criteria. The normal conception of political debate gives primacy to actions such as delivering messages as clearly and efficiently as possible, controlling how others receive and interpret messages, and promptly drawing dialogue to a conclusion so that real action can take place. The World Social Forum, however, aims to bring into being alternative forms of global citizenship and political deliberation, and citizen activists' participation in this multilingual, translated dialogue illustrates what these alternative forms might entail. Sociologist Doer, 2009, suggests, the need to translate discussions into different languages at meetings had the effect of lengthening discussions and increasing the effort required by participants to listen to each other, p. 154, emphasis added. She also notes, though, that while some social forum participants described the translation process as time-consuming, most did not consider the need for translations to be a problem, and instead thought of the slowness as a positive, as cited in Doer, 2009, p. 155. As one European Social Forum participant explained to Doer, when things slow down, then it gets more politically balanced, as cited in Doer, 2009, p. 155. The slow pace of dialoguing with translators seems to prompt valuable rhetorical work. It allows more time for participants to listen to, reflect on, and discover new ways to work with others' expressed ideas. This inventional activity in turn performs global citizenship as it broadens the public agenda and enacts more pluralistic processes of creating knowledge. The translators who enable this multilingual dialogue highlight another important aspect of global civic activity. Central to the World Social Forum and regional social forums are the efforts of a volunteer network of translators coordinated by the group Babbles. Significantly, Babbles volunteers see themselves as something other than passive conduits that simply translate what they hear others say. Instead, they approach translation work as opportunities to create political spaces at the intersections of language and cultural difference, and they identify themselves as political partners within the social forums, Babbles, 2005. At the organization's international conferences and within its online forums, Babbles volunteers learn and teach each other translation techniques that allow them to adapt to and work with the widely diverse participant communities, subject matter, and presentation formats within the social forum meetings. For Babbles translators, the acts of translating the languages and negotiating the cultural differences. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Copyright Cop. Rhetorical activities unique to each social forum are part of the larger comprehensive experiential approach of alter-globalist practices, Babbles, 2005. In other words, Babbles volunteers see alternative social arrangements being created through their translation work as well as the broad cross-cultural and cross-language dialogue it enables. This experiential approach toward creating alternative global societies underscores the potential for cross-language work to be an important means of enacting global citizenship. In terms of ASIN's definition of citizenship activity, translation can be a means of risk-taking necessary to create new transnational communities. It can be a means of widening public agendas, as it fosters greater participation and reinforces norms of inclusiveness and fairness in public debate. Given this collection's investment in rhetoric and writing across language boundaries, it is also important to note another result of the World Social Forums. Multilingual dialogue. Just as the Babbles volunteers continue to refine their translation techniques, many activists who participate in these translated meetings have learned to experiment with language and have built a diverse set of linguistic strategies to communicate with activists from other language groups. Doer, 2009, reports that activists have adopted new words into their lexicons and reached consensus on the meanings of translated words. Pages.
So it's almost like when we exposed ourselves to more ourselves, to more potentials for types of meaning making, we are, able to, find more common ground with one another. It's almost like limiting our potential, limiting our exposure limits our potential. Broadening our exposure broadens our potential. I don't know. That's what it
Pages
like
155 to 156. They have also learned to move between languages where it seemed beneficial to do so, and mixed the languages at other times. As one European Social Forum participant explained, we invent a special type of language here, our own one, and we invent a culture of communication, as cited in Doer, 2009, p. 155.
Okay.
This linguistic inventiveness highlights an important idea for rhetorical education and global citizenship. This rhetorical education must aim not simply to teach students how to master skills and knowledges in a single language or even in multiple, yet discrete, languages. Rather, this rhetorical education should also develop in students the willingness to try as best they can to collaborate in creating mutual understanding with people speaking and writing in other languages. As rhetoric scholar Bale, 1990, contends, rhetorical education is a means of developing an individual's character.
Yeah, shut up. Then the thing is that you go to school and you learn how to write and you learn how to read to create mutual understanding, right? Because we're like, well, if we create mutual understanding, then we will be able to communicate with one another. But then, like, it just kind of stops when you reach the end of your own language. Why does it have to stop? And we've already explored how, like, technically, it doesn't actually stop. Technically, language is still changing. Technically, you're still being exposed to new language. It's becoming a part of your lexicon, no matter whether you want to do it or not, right? It's happening. So why don't we just embrace it? Why don't we do it intentionally? Yeah. I really like the idea of, intentionality.
Character.
Okay.
In this sense, a rhetorical education for global citizenship would in part develop students who welcome and take risks in cross-language settings, all as a means to heighten their powers of flexibility and creativity in communication. A different communication strategy. In addition to this structure for creating multilingual meetings, the World Social Forum community also provides an important lesson for global citizenship in terms of deploying language diversity within transnational information campaigns. Since 2003, the Panos Institute West Africa, PIWA, has created the Flame of Africa print newspaper to provide African perspectives on the World Social Forum meetings. More recently, PIWA, 2005, with its mission to create democratic and open African societies based on public space that promotes change and social justice, Panos, expanded Flame of Africa to an online edition and a radio. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirocas.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?mark.id =sign1143714. Created from Humboldt on September 7, 2022, 22:31 and 58 seconds. Copyright 2013. 44 Scott Weibel. Production. In the lead-up to the World Social Forum meeting held in February 2011 in Dakar, Senegal, however, the African Social Forum solicited PIWA's help in creating an extensive communications strategy to ensure both that an African perspective on global issues could be heard by people throughout Africa and also be transmitted to the wider world. The African Social Forum's communication strategy was diverse. The texts at the heart of this communication strategy ranged from traditional mass media forms such as radio programs, videos, and printed newspapers and newsletters to a host of non-mass mediated modes of communication, such as local music, art, and handicrafts. African Social Forum, African Communications, 2010, pp. 4-6, 8-9. More important for the present reader's concerns, these texts, depending on each one's specific rhetorical situation, were produced in a number of local languages that are used transnationally throughout Africa, such as Swahili, Fulani, Malinke, and Bambara, with some also being translated into international languages such as English, French, and Arabic. 5. As the languages and audiences for each text varied, so did the specific topics, so that readers could see how neoliberal globalization policies affected their local communities, often in negative ways. Significantly, however, every piece of this communications campaign also highlighted how African citizens are challenging these policies and inventing alternative responses to them. The African Social Forum's multilingual communication strategy was enacted via a networked authoring process rather than a centralized one. The strategy relied on building new and leveraging existing networks with individuals and groups who are positioned in different geographic, cultural, and linguistic communities. African Social Forum, 2010. It included mobilizing the ever-growing number of citizen media outlets throughout Africa, connecting with independent media networks of global scope, and linking with local and international broadcast and print media professionals who have attended to social issues in their work. Each person in this network shared a similar vision about what the aims of the communication ought to be, but then each person worked to document different aspects of the relationship between global economics and local politics and cultures. Just as important, the authors in the network decided what languages and what locally relevant rhetorical strategies to use in developing their texts, and then the African Social Forum provided the resources to help participants compose and distribute their texts. The use of local languages was vitally important to the African Social Forum's communications strategy for both pragmatic and symbolic reasons. These social activists see Western languages such as English and French as the languages that policymakers and journalists have used to compose the image of Africans as lazy, dependent victims unable to help themselves. African Social Forum, 2010. This image, African activists maintain, has worked to sustain a global policy-making process in which non-Western perspectives and cultural logics are often absent, ignored, or misrepresented. By building a network of people working in local literacy as translingual practice, between community rhetorical activities of global citizens 45 languages, generating local content for publications, and highlighting local
Shit. No, oh my god, okay, we are on page 45.
By a person's desire to
2, 3, 4, 45.
Rhetorical activities of global citizens 45 languages, generating local content for publications, and highlighting local activities that resist neoliberal globalization policies. The African Social Forum hoped to assert an image of Africans as resilient and inventive, as agents who work together rather than relying on outside help to create positive social change. African Social Forum, 2010. The African Social Forum's communications strategy is compelling in a few ways when considering how to reimagine the concerns of rhetorical education in an era of globalization. This strategy explicitly builds on the African Social Forum's Charter of Principles, which emphasizes not only stimulating reflection but also the maximum transparent circulation of the results of this reflection. African Social Forum.
Hold on. The maximum transparent circulation. Results of this reflection. In other words, the communication strategy partly involved creating insightful analysis of how local African communities were challenging neoliberal globalization. This is important, however, the strategy also entailed circulating this analysis transnationally throughout Africa and the wider world and creating opportunities for Africans from many different language communities to join the dialogue on global policies, intervention, and delivery. So how do we create things, and how do we get these things out to as many people as possible?
Forum, 2003. In other words, the communication strategy partly involved creating insightful analysis of how local African communities were challenging neoliberal globalization. Just as important, however, the strategy also entailed circulating this analysis transnationally throughout Africa and the wider world and creating opportunities for Africans from many different language communities to join the dialogue on global policies. The emphasis here on both invention and delivery, on prompting reflection and on circulating the knowledge that emerges from it, highlights the need for readers to design strategies for reaching multilingual audiences. As Asen suggests, enacting citizenship in part entails putting one's beliefs into the open and inviting greater public participation. In today's globalizing world, and in today's increasingly multilingual U.S., efforts to foster broader public dialogue demand an attention to language diversity and the need for translation. Putting one's beliefs into the open means delivering them in relevant linguistic forms to forums in which stakeholders from different language groups can read them and respond to them. Significantly, however, the African Social Forum's communication strategy challenges the notion that a single reader must necessarily possess some sort of cosmopolitan ideal of fluent multilingualism in a host of languages. That is, the forum's strategy emphasizes collaborating and networking with people in different political, cultural, and linguistic communities rather than solitary composing. The idea here is that rhetorical education for global citizenship should prompt
So we have this idea that it was in the first article that we read from this text too. We have this idea that learning how to do language and reproducing language is this like solo act that you can learn how to do perfectly, and you will become the next great American novelist who's, whatever. But this is we're prompting reflections on the limit of a monolingual communication strategy, not just a monolingual communication strategy, but a single individual communication strategy. It's networking. You gotta be part of a community. You gotta foster communities, and fostering communities fosters thought. And the best ideas. Look, I'm always going to say this. We are dumb. Humans are dumb on our own. The reason why we have survived is because we know how to get together. And the more people that are getting together, the smarter we're going to be, because the more diverse set of experiences and understandings and knowledge there will be. One person alone, kind of dumb. A whole bunch of people together, a little bit less dumb. Okay. So, when we get together and we work together, we do good things.
Reflection on the limits of a monolingual communication strategy, limits in terms of both to whom texts might circulate and from whom texts invite response. This rhetorical education would also help people begin to generate a range of strategies for building a multilingual network through which to develop and circulate ideas, strategies ranging from securing volunteer or professional translation and localization services to learning to develop creativity, not perfection, in language use. Rhetorical education would put less emphasis on efficiency in communication and grant more value to patience. It would give more attention to learning how to listen in cross-cultural and cross-language contexts. Students would learn how to work at the borders of language well enough to forge relationships with similarly invested citizens. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirocast.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?mark.id =$1143714. Copyright Cop 46 Scott Weibel. Implications. These examples from the World Social Forum's deliberative practices and public information campaigns suggest that, to loosely paraphrase the forum's motto, another means of communicating is possible. As Isocrates reminds us, rhetorical education scholars have long been concerned with the skills and knowledges that students need to govern the affairs of the household and the Commonwealth. Participants in the World Social Forum enact global citizenship in part by listening to people from other regions and other cultures analyze how global policies affect their local activities. Equally as important, their global citizenship practices also underscore the benefits of learning to work with or across the borders of language diversity. Rhetorical education for global citizenship is about cultivating an attitude that leads students to listen to people from many different language groups and to share their experiences of inventing local solutions to manage BAL problems. This multilingual political communication can enable global citizens to develop a broader base of knowledge about how to define global problems and how to create strategies for resolving them. Another world is possible, and cross-language practices are an important means for global citizens to bring that world into being. References.
No, thank you.
African Social Forum. 2003, July. Charter of Principles and Values of the African Social Forum.
Okay, here we go. No, thank you.
Social Forum. Retrieved from http://www.africansocialforum.org/english/.
Okay, do we have more to read? We do.
5. Redefining Indigenous. Rhetoric 1 from Places of Origin to Translingual. Spaces of Interdependence. Indifference. Lumming Mouth. Introduction, 2 competing motives and 1 shared discourse. Lately China has witnessed a feverish revival of red culture, the Maoist-era songs, as part of the campaign led by the Communist Party to celebrate the 90th anniversary of its founding on July 1, 2011. Schools, state-owned companies, and neighborhood committees have been asked to organize choirs to stage musical numbers and sing what has now been referred to as red songs. Maoist CLAS 6, including The East is Red, Sailing the Sea Depends on the Helmsman, and Without the Communist Party There Would Be No New China, have returned to the airways with a vengeance. Hundreds of millions of school children, teachers, officials, and retirees have been organized to lend their voices to these red songs, and they apparently have embraced them with genuine interest. Beach, 2011. In the city of Chongqing, for example, even prisons are holding sing-alongs, and one psychiatric hospital has prescribed red songs for patients. In initiatives
What?
reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution, the local government has ordered each cotter to live with a family in the countryside for a month, transmitted Maoist slogans to residents via text messages, and told television stations to fill primetime hours with educational red programming and cut all commercial advertising. E. Wang, 2011. What do we make of all this? Does this campaign signal that the party is attempting to reverse course and to take China back to the revolutionary era again, however expedient or temporary it might be? Or, if these red songs are indeed being brought back for the sole purpose of commemorating the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, then how do we reconcile this apparent literacy, copyright 48 Lumming Mao contradiction between the revival of a retro-red ideology, E. Wang, 2011, and the ongoing social and economic reforms whose underlying values are anything but red? The party's motive in launching this red culture revival is perhaps easy to ferret out. Point 2 By way of reviving these revolutionary songs, the party seems to be interested in connecting ordinary Chinese to a recent past when love for the country and loyalty to the party apparently reigned supreme, and when the gap of the present time between the rich and the poor was nowhere to be seen. The invocation of such a past serves as a timely response to the widespread apathy and distrust among the population, and it aims to rekindle their patriotism toward the country and restore their confidence in the party. In fact, I want to suggest that this campaign represents an integral part of the party's ongoing effort to construct a new rhetoric or to rebrand an existing or almost forgotten one that can best promote cultural nationalism and protect its hold on power. Appealing to its own revolutionary heritage lends this new rhetoric native legitimacy and authority, both of which are slipping away from the party in the face of globalizing capitalism and its attending ideology. The response so far exhibited by hundreds of millions of ordinary Chinese, on the other hand, comes as a bit of a surprise to many Chinese liberal elites. Beach, 2011, E. Wang, 2011. Not only because these red songs have been associated with the era of radicalism, hysteria, and zealotry, but also because ordinary Chinese generally have shown cynicism in the recent past toward any party-led campaign that smells of politics, let alone red politics. However, there...
What does that mean? Hold on. Chinese generally have shown cynicism in the recent past towards any party-led... Okay, so we're talking about politics. Political party. Campaign that smells like of politics. What it... I don't... Maybe it's a typo. Maybe it's a typo. Maybe it's a typo. I have no idea what's going on right now. This is just so far out of... What are we doing here? You know what I'm saying? I mean, maybe...
5.
What do you have to say?
Redefining indigenous.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Of the present time between the rich and the poor was nowhere to be seen. The invocation of such a past serves as a time. The response so far exhibited by hundreds of millions of ordinary Chinese, on the other hand, comes as a bit of a surprise to many Chinese liberal elites.
I'm not sure what's going
2011,
on here,
E. Wang, 2011. Not only because these red songs have been associated with the era of radicalism, hysteria, and zealotry, but also because ordinary Chinese generally have shown cynicism in the recent past toward any party-led campaign that smells of politics, let alone red politics. However, their willingness to sing along may very well betray a competing motive, one that is not so much about joining the party in its campaign to instill patriotism and loyalty as about reclaiming their own sense of moral belonging and agency, which has been severely undermined by the ongoing economic and social reforms and by the increasing wealth and power gap. It is also more about trying to reconcile their lived experiences with the import of these red songs. Like the party, they must also develop a new rhetoric or rebrand an existing or almost forgotten one that can mobilize and empower them. A rebranded revolutionary discourse, which preaches harmony and loyalty, and which yields new discursive alignments, seems to offer an efficacious native medicine for the ills ordinary Chinese are experiencing. To draw from Bourdieu, 1977, what they are singing then is neither the lyrics, nor the music per se, but their entire social personhood and its attending social and cultural conditions, pages 653 to 655. Singing these red songs, therefore, becomes their way of searching for a meaningful rhetoric. In spite...
I just don't know. Searching for a meaningful that's all songs. That's all songs. It's all music. That's how we experience art and literature and music that we enjoy. We are searching for a meaningful rhetoric. We are searching for something that means something to us, and when we find something that means something to us, we enjoy it. It's really, really weird how this author is approaching this. It's really weird. I'm not sure what to think about it, actually.
Spite of their varying motives, and in spite of their different positions of power, both the party and ordinary Chinese appear to be reconstructing and embracing the same rhetoric, one that is indigenous to them and unsullied by globalizing capitalism of the present time. Such a rhetoric can then accord them the necessary agency with which to speak to or stand up to the dominant discourses on the Chinese discursive terrain. Literacy as translingual practice, between copyright, redefining indigenous rhetoric 49. What, then, exactly are these red songs if they can be claimed as examples of Chinese indigenous rhetoric? More generally, what are examples of indigenous rhetoric of the 21st century? Under what conditions do they arise? Can indigenous rhetoric remain tethered to its place of origin even as it is entering and claiming new spaces where the modus operandi is the establishment not of provenance but of interdependence indifference in the making? What is the relationship between indigenous rhetoric and translingual practices? 3. It is to these questions that I now turn. From the almost forgotten to the importantly present, the rise of red songs as Chinese indigenous rhetoric.
Who's the author? What page are we on? We are on page 49. Who's the author of this? Booming Mao. Okay, so this is probably a person who has better
rhetoric
context.
To characterize any given rhetoric as indigenous is to highlight the fact that it originated from the place where its participants continue to live, and that its history has been marked by rejection, subordination, and or exploitation, as the case might be. Since any indigenous rhetoric in the
I feel like there's an important context that I'm missing here. And I'm not sure if that's intentional or unintentional.
21st century is bound to dialogue with or speak back to other discourses in search for its rightful place on the global discursive terrain. I suggest that we characterize indigenous rhetoric as rhetoric of hybridity born of a creative process where the indigenous and the exogenous engage with each other, and where the discursive past of the indigenous makes its presence felt in the global present. Indigenous rhetoric is further informed by a recovery and reclaiming imperative and all-out effort to recover and reconstitute a native past that has been ignored, ill-regarded, or altogether erased by an exogenous power. Moreover, what in large part shapes this recovery and reclaiming imperative is likely the project of cultural nationalism, of asserting a claim on the larger national and cultural imaginary, which gives rise to collective identity, community, and a sense of peoplehood. Omi and Wynant, 1994, p. 40. For example, these Maoist-era songs could be said to have provided their promoters and followers with a much-needed sense of indigeneity and ownership. As signifiers of a retro-red ideology, they cannot help but forge ideological bonds and stir up national pride among the population because their lyrics portray a new China that is created and nurtured by the supreme leadership of Chairman Mao, and its people whose love for the party and the motherland is unparalleled. Many ordinary Chinese have participated in the experiences portrayed by these songs. By embracing these songs, both the party and ordinary Chinese are able not only to cultivate nostalgia for a recent past, the utopian ideals of which seem to be gaining favor as the gap between the haves and have-nots in the present time keeps widening, but also to contest the globalizing liberal ideologies whose presence in China has taken center stage. Here is the first stanza of the lyrics to There Will Be No New China Without the Community Party, one of many red songs that have been brought back in this revival campaign. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, copyright 50 Lumming Mao. There will be no new China without the Community Party. There will be no new China without the Community Party. The Community Party has shed blood and sweat for the nation, it has devoted itself to the cause of liberating China. It has opened the path for liberation for its people, it has led China to a bright future. It has fought the Japanese for 8 years, it has improved people's lives, it has opened up revolutionary bases, and it has practiced democracy. There will be no new China without the Community Party. There will be no new China without the Community Party. Point 4, X Wang, 2001, p. 164. A panegyric through and through, these, and indeed the rest of the lyrics in the song lend the party the necessary rhetoric with which to reclaim its revolutionary heritage and, more importantly, to re-establish its lost credibility and authority. At the same time, they also allow ordinary Chinese to use this rebranded revolutionary past as their own rhetorical antidote to the dizzying capitalist present so that the path for social and economic liberation will be open to them, and so that they can still be part of this new China. As these red songs are being rebranded as a viable alternative to the ideological challenges brought on by the ongoing social and economic reforms, they are beginning to construct a new order on the Chinese discursive terrain. This new order is to redefine and reshape the relationship between what is importantly present and what is merely present, or, better still, between what is importantly present and what is almost forgotten. By importantly present I draw upon Hall and Ames, 1995, to mean that the importance of any particular belief or any set of ideologies in a culture depends not on its mere presence or its past presence, but on whether it is importantly present in such a way that it significantly qualifies, defines, or otherwise shapes the culture. p. 15. Prior to this revival campaign orchestrated by the party, these red songs had almost been left in the dustbin of history. Since their revival, they have begun to make their presence felt, transforming themselves from the almost forgotten to the importantly present as they help restore credibility for the party and relevance and agency for ordinary Chinese. Of course, what must be emphasized is that the emerging status of the importantly present is anything but secure because other competing rhetorics are bound to contest its newly acquired status and to compete for the right to control and dominate the same space. The question now becomes this: can these red songs remain tied to their place of origin, to their revolutionary past? Are they not already weakening, if not severing altogether, the link to such a past by their rebranded presence or by what they are enacting in the present time? Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Sir.
Okay, so hold on. The question now becomes this: can these red songs remain tied to their place of origin, to their revolutionary past? Are they not already weakening, if not severing altogether, the link to such past by the rebranded presence or by what they are enacting in the present time? Okay, so this is, again, we're back to the idea, authorial intent. You know, what was this song for? What is the word for? And how do we use it in a way that perhaps changes its meaning and alters, how it is perceived? So we're using the same thing to create different meaning. So, as with the previous article, can we find commonalities speaking different languages, or do we all have to speak the same language? Well, a person singing this song in the present has a different meaning for it than a person singing this song in the past. So those two people are going to fundamentally disagree over what the song is about. Even though they're singing the exact same song with the exact same words. So that's what's happening here.
And relevance and agency for ordinary Chinese. Of course, what must be emphasized is that the emerging status of the importantly present is anything but secure because other competing rhetorics are bound to contest its newly acquired status and to compete for the right to control and dominate the same space.
It's like,
the question now becomes this: can these red songs remain tied to
the reclamation of slurs? Can you reclaim a slur, or is a slur always going to have the meaning that it had when it was originally a thing? And some people would say yes, and some people would say no, and some people would say we're working towards it, but the history is really, it's just too fucking recent, so it's going to be our term that we are reclaiming, and you can't use it. That's why we have, different slurs for queer people. That's why we have the N-word. You can't say the N-word as a white person because you have not reclaimed it. You didn't reclaim it. There are still people out there who use the N-word as a slur and want to. But people of color, black people specifically, some of them decide to use the N-word as a way of reclaiming it, as a way of changing its meaning. That's why we have the difference between the soft A and the hard R, right? Because it's a process of reclamation that is changing the way this word is used contextually. And there are still some inappropriate contexts, so don't use the word. But there are appropriate contexts, as in when you're a black person and you're reclaiming the word. So, yeah.
Tied to their place of origin, to their revolutionary past? Are they not already weakening, if not severing altogether, the link to such a past by their rebranded presence or by what they are enacting in the present time? Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013.
Yes.
ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirocast.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?mark.id =1143714. Created from Humboldt on September 7, 2022, 22:31 and 58 seconds. Copyright 2000. Redefining Indigenous Rhetoric 51. Indigenous rhetoric in the 21st century, I suggest, can no longer remain tethered to its place of origin, and that our conceptualization of it must be based on the larger context to which they are inextricably connected, and with which they are invariably expected to dialogue. According to Mignolo, 1998, the current stage of globalization, transnational corporations and technoglobalism is creating the condition for and enacting the relocation of languages and the fracture of culture, thus engineering the uncoupling of the natural link between languages and nations, languages and national memories, languages and national literature. p. 42. Indigenous rhetoric undergoes a similar decoupling process. That is, it disassociates itself from a place defined by physical boundaries and moves into a space populated by discursive practices and ideological exigencies. In the process, it establishes new connections that cross traditional boundaries and defies the existing hierarchies that privilege one ideology over other competing or emerging ideology or ideologies. Whatever the original link, natural or otherwise, it ties any given indigenous rhetoric to its place of origin, and dissolves under the weight of porous boundaries and fractured cultures. Therefore, what makes these revolutionary songs indigenous is not about a revolutionary past marked by borders and chronological timelines, or about how such a past makes its origin claim through these origin identity markers. Rather, what makes them indigenous is the borderless space these songs have entered, where they claim their unique link, however weakened or even imagined, to a utopian past, and accord the party and ordinary Chinese the authority and legitimacy for their respective positions in the present time. In addition, as indigenous rhetoric, these red songs are always in the process of being constituted and reconstituted in a multi-authored act of representation, re-representation, or even counter-representation, forever preparing for new relationships and new alignments to emerge without forgetting the inherent right and ability of peoples to determine their own communicative needs and desires. Lyons, 2000, p. 449, emphasis in original. Consequently, the rebranding of these red songs can lead to some unintended incongruities between, for example, their retro-red ideology and the ideology of globalizing capitalism, and between what they were created to accomplish then, to incite revolution, and what they are being primed to perform now, to cultivate harmony and unity. The most extreme incongruity can be seen or experienced in these red songs when they become flipped, that is, when their meanings become completely reversed, giving rise to an example of counter-representation. A case in point is the red song "There Will Be No New China Without the Community Party." Its complete reverse has appeared on the virtual space. Titled "A New China Without the Party," 2009, its lyrics begin and conclude with the line, "Only without the Communist Party will there be a new China." And stanza after stanza, the new lyrics negate and make a total mockery of the original ones, and together they turn into a scathing rebuke and condemnation of the party and of what it has done since it seized power in 1949. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirocast.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?mark.id =1143714. Created from Humboldt on September 7. Copyright 52 Lumming Mao. There is one more dimension that deserves our attention regarding these red songs. As Chinese indigenous rhetoric, they reshape and redefine the relationship between what is importantly present and what is merely present or what is almost forgotten from within. At the same time, they cannot help but speak to and interact with what is importantly present, merely present, or almost forgotten from without. To be more specific, while these red songs are intended to help legitimize a new cultural and national order in China, their revival has to be understood within the overall global context. That is, the relevance and importance of the rebranded red songs is being made possible both by the internal nostalgia for a mythical past of innocence, equality, and harmony, and by the external ideology of capitalist globalization. These songs thus move, to quote cultural theorist Lu Kang, 1998, between historically changing fields of struggle and habitus of discrete dispositions, p. 169, out of which their significance and cultural capital are being legitimate, recognized, and experienced. This kind of movement or interaction from both within and without brings together and re-engages different discourses, importantly present, merely present, and almost forgotten. Further, it enables them to enter and influence one another's discursive fields. By discursive fields I mean textual spaces where related terms and concepts form clusters to speak to one another, and where semantic alignments and subject positions take shape and acquire authority and legitimacy. As they become connected to one another, these discourses will be for audience and dominance amidst tension, indeterminacy, and even contradiction. While it does not resolve or dissolve tension or difference, togetherness of this kind calls on us to reconsider or recalibrate such perennial binaries as being and becoming, permanence and process, self and other, and inside and outside. For example, togetherness of this kind further transforms and solidifies these interwoven and interconnected relationships, creating translingual spaces of interdependence and difference in the making. For example, below are the lyrics of The East is Red, one of the Red songs that is perhaps the most well-known. The East is red, the sun rises. China has produced a Mao Zedong. He seeks happiness for people, and he is our great savior. Chairman Mao loves people. He is our leader. To build a new China he is guiding us forward. The Communist Party is like the sun. Wherever it shines it has light. Wherever the party goes, the people become liberated. Eulogy of Mao Zedong, 1978, pages 1-9. Literacy as translingual practice, between communities and copyright, redefining indigenous rhetoric 53. These lyrics worship and eulogize Chairman Mao and the party to an unprecedented degree, affirming them as saviors and elevating them to the status of sainthood. As this and other Red songs are being sung on a mass scale, they inevitably mark a disturbingly jarring presence punctuating this euphoria for market economy and Western liberal individualism. They jostle with other discourses for audience and uptake, since their own meanings are anything but secure. For example,
unprecedented degree. I mean, you know,
example, happiness,
I
liberation,
don't know
and democracy could connote very different implications to different audiences. For those ordinary Chinese, whose economic fortunes have not benefited from the ongoing economic and social reforms, these words become either completely empty or quite ironic because of an inescapable contradiction between what these words are saying and what is taking place on the ground. And for those who have made it, they may very well attribute their happiness, liberation, and democracy not to the party, but to capitalist and other Western ideologies. And still for many other Chinese, these Red songs have enabled them to reconnect to a past of which they were an integral part, and their happiness, liberation, and democracy depend on this nostalgia for a past, not on renewed love and loyalty for the party in the present time. Yet, amid this kind of cacophony and incongruity, further fueled by a combi nation of folk melodies and features characteristic of Western mass songs, 5 these Red songs become Chinese indigenous rhetoric in the 21st century. The louder or more important they grow, the more varied their uptake may become. Not only can individual Chinese deploy these Red songs to address their different rhetorical exigencies as they try to make sense of the clashes or conflicts between the retro-Red ideology and discourses of global capitalism in their daily lives, but also groups and institutions are likely to claim these Red songs as their very own, as representing or validating their own voice and vision for a new China. Even Western liberal discourses may jump on the bandwagon as they fend off serious challenges on the ground and as they try to hold onto their positions of influence and dominance. There is simply no shortage of efforts being expended to utilize these songs to suit one's own ideological needs or to advance one's own political agendas. The more these efforts are being put forth, the more translingual these Red songs will become. It is this kind of interdependence and difference in the making that may best characterize Chinese indigenous rhetoric or, for that matter, indigenous rhetoric in general right now. Conclusion, a few implications. Discourses travel. As they do, they mingle, negotiate, and further contend with other discourses in search of new homes. Along the way they experience adulation, comprehension, miscomprehension, apprehension, and / or rejection amidst some highly asymmetrical structures of power. They participate in a transformative process in which, to paraphrase L. Liu, 1995, discursive differences are being fought out, authorities invoked and challenged, ambiguities dissolved or created. Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest eBook Central, http://ebookcentral.pirocast.com/lib/humboldt/detail.action?doc ID =$1143714. Created from Humboldt on September 7, 2022, 22:31 and 58 seconds. Copyright 2013. Taylor and Francis Group. All rights reserved.
cannot
54 Lumming Mao. Until new words and meanings emerge, p. 26, or, I might add, until old words and meanings become rebranded or reconstituted. Indigenous rhetoric is no exception. While the place of origin will always attend indigenous rhetoric wherever it travels, its values and significances will be more dependent on the new home it has found, and, to adapt a famous expression of Levi Strauss, on how good it is being made there to think with, Lloyd, 1996, p. 122. My characterization of these Maoist-era songs as rhetorical is not necessarily new. It has long been noted that songs are often rhetorical, and they often convey powerful messages, address exigencies, arouse emotions, and carry out ideological agendas. Blue, 2004, p. 100. However, in calling our attention to these red songs that are now being revived in China, I am interested in not only spelling out the particularizing conditions under which they have arisen, but also articulating the rhetorical use they now have been deployed to perform. Moreover, I see these red songs as a form of Chinese indigenous rhetoric, as part of a new discourse the ownership of which is being contested and reconstituted at the present moment. As should be made evident by now, to characterize these revolutionary songs as indigenous rhetoric is to challenge, and to break away from, the tyranny of place that has influenced our understanding of indigenous rhetoric. It is further to put more emphasis on the new discursive space, and on how it redefines and reshapes indigenous rhetoric. Perhaps more important, as the new kid on the discursive block, these red songs provide us a compelling example of how meanings get made and remade in close relationship to their varying attending circumstances, and of how the relationship between the importantly present, the merely present, and the almost forgotten undergo the process of realignment, reformation, and reconstitution. In short, as these red songs travel from their place of origin to the new space, their indigeneity is not so much transformed when they travel from one place to the other as invented within this new translingual space where the primary mode of representation becomes interdependence in difference in the making, and where new subject positions arise to acquire agency and legitimacy. To study the revival of red songs and its rhetorical significances also has immediate implications for our writing classrooms and pedagogies. For example, we writing teachers now can use the revival of red songs to illustrate how meaning gets made or remade and how discourses find their new homes. We can help our students better appreciate this dynamic, transformative meaning-making process that is fraught with uncertainty, incongruity, and possibility. Equally important, as the field of composition moves more decisively toward what Horner, N. E. Camp, and Donahue have recently called a translingual norm, 2011, pages 286 to 287, we can invite our students to engage these red songs as an example of moving between discourses in a global context and of developing a critical understanding of how appropriateness and rhetorical importance are both tied to histories of ideas and to local or immediate occasions of use. Just as the party and ordinary Chinese can deploy these same red songs to enact their different agencies in Literacy as Translingual Practice, Between Communities and Classrooms, edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, Taylor and Francis Group, 2013. ProQuest ebook Central, http://ebook Central, copyright 2013. Taylor and Francis Group. All rights reserved. Redefining Indigenous Rhetoric 55. To realize their different ideological agendas, so our students can learn to imagine their own context where the use of these red songs becomes rhetorically effective and appropriate to them. In addition, as we embrace a multimodal approach to the teaching of writing, we can stage the singing of red songs, as well as other songs, to demonstrate the multiple ways in which meaning can be composed and communicated and embodied performance can be valued and validated. Only by promoting all available means of communication across language and culture can we truly prepare our students for this new translingual space constituted by multilingualism, multimodality, and multiple forms of interdependence in difference. Notes. 1. The use of the singular, rather than the plural, noun rhetoric in indigenous rhetoric here, and elsewhere in this chapter, aims to contest the dominance of European American rhetoric and its exclusionary biases. It does not mean or imply at all that indigenous rhetoric is monolithic, homogeneous, or unaffected by shifting political, social, and cultural forces. For more on this point, and on its underlying paradox, see Mao and Young, 2008, pages 8 to 11. And I defy any rhetoric as the systematic, effective use of language and other symbolic resources in political, social, and cultural contexts to respond to discursive patterns and crises at a given point in time in society and to construct new discursive orders and material conditions. 2. The revival of red culture was initially launched by the now deposed Chinese leader Bo Zilan, who became party secretary in Chongqing in 2007. The revival campaign.
Oh, it's reading through the footnotes. Okay. And I think that's the last paper. Oh my god, really? Okay, so what did we learn today? How do we bring all of these different things together? Shit, I don't know. That's a hard one, you know? So, you know, we have the broad concept of translingualism, right? We use language for different reasons in different places at different times, and this means that necessarily language needs to change. Or it's going to change. It has to change. And we're all different people, so of course language is going to change. So we can either try to keep language pure and distinct and separate, which is not going to really happen, and is only going to lead to students being harmed, really. Or we could try to approach translingualism and accept that language is going to change, and students' needs, our needs, people's needs, our general needs and uses for language aren't some, you know, properly defined, easily defined, singular solo practice. Our needs for language depend on where we are, who we're talking to, and what we're talking about. And when we're talking to, because, you know, the songs. A song means a different thing depending on its contextuality, upon its time. People singing the exact same song are going to have different meanings for it in different times and different places. We take songs that other people have used and we repurpose them for different things. Another example of this is Bella Ciao. Bella Ciao is a good representation of an anti-fascist revolutionary song that is about the working people, you know, protesting against. I don't know the specifics. I don't know. Go Google it. Go look it up on Wikipedia. You get a better explanation than I can give. But anyway, you know, it's different examples of the way that we use language at different times. And yeah, Bella Ciao is a good example. And so how do we teach language? We teach language the way that people need us to teach it to them. Which is, I think, is what I said last time. We don't teach English based on what we believe English is. We teach English or reading and writing. We don't teach reading and writing based on consequences has an exact dictionary definition term. We teach reading and writing based on what different meaning are you using for the term consequences, and how is your audience going to respond to these various uses of the term consequences. So if I'm teaching my class, you know, it's the first day of English, we all go in and we're all learning how to use the word consequences, right? Am I going to teach everybody in the class that this is what consequences mean? No, I'm going to ask everybody in the class, what does consequences mean to you? Would you rather have rewards or consequences? And they're going to say, well, you know, I think I'd rather have rewards. And I'm going to be like, rewards are a form of consequences. The consequences are, you know, contextually kind of bad. So both and rather than either or. Both and. It's a both and. It's always both and. And maybe not always both and, but I think a lot of the time. A lot of the answers to questions, a lot of the answers to problems are both ands rather than either ors. And I think that sometimes we get too bogged down in the opposing binary imaginings that we forget that these opposing binary imaginings are just ways that we contextualize broader actions and impressions. So, you know, especially like, you know, things that aren't actually like the concept of the man and the woman, and the man and woman, the male and female are these like opposing binary. They're binary oppositions. That's it. I mean, male and female are not binary oppositions. We just think they are. We just think they are. They're not actually. That's why, you know, people get so mad when they're like, "Oh, this person is trans." Well, man is the opposite of woman, so you can't be trans. You can't, because it's just how it is. It's just, just how it is. Language is malleable. Language is permeable. Language is fun. Language is fun. Language is fun. Language is whatever the fuck you want to do with it. And whatever you want to do with it. And however you want to do with it. And the more you do, the more you know, I guess. I don't know. I'm trying to synthesize here. I'm trying to synthesize. And it's harder to synthesize like IRL talking than it is to synthesize on a piece of paper. But I think we're approaching something, maybe something useful. Something useful. Now, if you enjoyed this segment, I hate to tell you, we are going to be transitioning to a new segment, because this is it's the trans broadcast. I'm non-binary. Hi, how you doing? Non-binary. Non-binary is the type of trans. Not all trans thing involves a physical transition. Some transing is just recognizing that you are in the process of transition all the time. It's just, we learn fun things here. We weren't see that's another one. That's another way that we can relate to this article. For some people, for some trans people, trans is I'm transing my gender from male to female. Female to male. One or the other. I don't know. Whatever you want to do, right? And then for some people, non-binary people, well, I mean some specific non-binary people, because maybe there's other non-binary people who are like, I want to trans my gender to something else. For other people, certain non-binary people, maybe even certain binary trans people, trans is just, existing in the state of transition, where we're always changing, even if we're not like physically changing. We're always physically changing, because you're always getting older. Your skin is like falling off in little specks as you sleep at night. So technically, everybody in the world is trans. I'm sorry to tell you, but we're all trans. That's kind of ridiculous. We're being ridiculous here. But it's okay, because I'm non-binary. I can say that. You can't say that. Don't say that. No, I don't know. But anyway, thank you for joining for the Reading Rainbow but Gayer segment. In transit today, apparently. We're moving on to the next segment, so I'm gonna take a short break. I'm gonna bang my head against the desk a few times. Why am I gonna do that? Because we're moving to The Witcher, and I'm notoriously terrible at The Witcher controls. And I was like, dude, I think the best way to get The Witcher controls is just play the fucking game, and maybe eventually it'll come to me. I want to try to put my Xbox controller on it, but I don't know how well that's going to work. So anyway, I'm going to take a quick break. Maybe, like stuff some food in my face, do, little human things like that. I am, yeah, I'm human. We're all human here, I hope. I mean, maybe like somebody's cat just like climbed across the keyboard and somehow like landed on this stream, which, hello cat. Nice to have you in the stream. Nice to meet you. I am a human. I don't know if you can understand me. I don't even know if you're like registering that I'm looking at you. I'm going to wave my arms around so you have something exciting to look at and you can like swat at the screen, and hopefully that breaks the computer screen. Okay, I'm going to stop doing that. Sorry I broke your computer screen, whoever's, we're being silly. Okay? Yeah, I'll be right back.